There is a basement beneath Jordan Hall at Stanford University, and if you had walked through it in the summer of 1971 during the ordinary months of June or July, you would have found nothing remarkable about it at all. Just a long, quiet corridor lined with faculty offices and storage rooms, the kind of institutional hallway that exists in every university building in America, lit by fluorescent tubes that hum faintly and cast everything in a pale, sterile glow. The floor a polished linoleum that squeaks beneath rubber soles, the walls a shade of off-white that no one ever chose, but that simply appeared one day and was never questioned. The sort of place you pass through on your way to somewhere else without ever truly seeing it. The kind of space that architecture forgot. And yet, by August of that year, this unremarkable corridor would become the setting for one of the most disturbing and controversial experiments in the history of psychology. An experiment that would reveal something so unsettling about human nature that its implications would haunt researchers, ethicists, philosophers, and ordinary people for more than half a century. An experiment that would demonstrate with terrifying clarity just how quickly the structures of civilization can dissolve when certain conditions are met, and how the thin membrane separating the decent person from the cruel one is far more fragile than any of us would like to believe. The basement of Jordan Hall was about to become a prison, and the young men who would walk into it as volunteers, as willing participants in what they believed would be a simple, even boring 2-week study, would walk out of it changed in ways they could not have anticipated, in ways that some of them would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. But before we descend into that basement, before we meet the guards and the prisoners and the man who set it all in motion, we need to understand the world that made this experiment not only possible, but, in the minds of those who designed it, necessary. The year is 1971, and America is a country at war with itself in nearly every sense of the phrase. The conflict in Vietnam has been grinding on for years, and the images that flicker across television screens each evening, the napalm and the body bags and the hollow-eyed soldiers wading through rice paddies, have fractured the national psyche in ways that are still being catalogued and understood. The My Lai massacre, in which American soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and elderly people, had been revealed to the public just 2 years earlier, and the trial of Lieutenant William Calley, the officer who had led the massacre, was unfolding in real time, forcing Americans to confront a question they desperately did not want to face. How could ordinary American boys, the sons of farmers and factory workers and school teachers, young men who had grown up playing baseball and going to church and saying the Pledge of Allegiance, how could they have done something so monstrous? The comfortable answer, the one that allowed people to sleep at night, was that Calley and his men were aberrations, bad apples, psychologically defective individuals who had somehow slipped through the cracks of the military's screening process. But a growing number of psychologists and social scientists were beginning to suspect that this explanation was not only insufficient, but dangerously wrong, that the capacity for cruelty was not a defect found only in damaged individuals, but a potential that existed in virtually everyone, waiting to be activated by the right set of circumstances. This question, the question of whether evil is a property of certain individuals or a product of certain situations, was not new in 1971, but it had taken on a new urgency in the decades following the Second World War, and particularly in the years following the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961. Eichmann, one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, the man who had organized the transportation of millions of Jews to the death camps with the efficiency of a railroad dispatcher scheduling freight, had been captured by Israeli agents in Argentina and brought to trial before the world, and what had shocked observers most was not the magnitude of his crimes, but the ordinariness of his person. Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher who covered the trial for The New Yorker, had coined the phrase "the banality of evil" to describe what she observed in the courtroom. This small, balding, bespectacled bureaucrat who sat behind his glass partition and spoke in the careful, evasive language of middle management, a man who seemed incapable of independent thought, who insisted again and again that he had merely been following orders, that he had been a cog in a machine, that he had never personally harboured any particular hatred toward Jews, that he had simply been doing his job. And while Arendt's thesis was controversial, and while many argued that she had been too generous in her assessment, too willing to take Eichmann at his word, the question she raised was one that psychology could not ignore. Was it possible that the machinery of genocide could be operated by people who were, in every conventional sense, Normal. It was in this intellectual climate that a young psychologist named Stanley Milgram, working at Yale University, had designed an experiment in the early 1960s that would become one of the most famous and most troubling studies in the history of social science. Milgram's experiment was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its results. Volunteers were brought into a laboratory and told they would be participating in a study of learning and memory. They were assigned the role of teacher and instructed to administer electric shocks to a learner sitting in another room whenever the learner gave a wrong answer to a series of questions. The shocks increased in intensity with each wrong answer, from a mild 15 volts all the way up to a potentially lethal 450 volts. The learner, who was actually a confederate of the experimenter, was never actually shocked, but the teacher did not know this. What the teacher heard, through the wall separating the two rooms, were increasingly desperate cries of pain, pleas to stop the experiment, screams, and eventually, at the highest voltage levels, an ominous silence. The question Milgram was asking was simple. At what point would ordinary people refuse to obey the authority figure in the white lab coat, who stood beside them and calmly instructed them to continue? The answer was chilling. Roughly 65% of participants administered the maximum shock, the full 450 volts, despite the screams, despite the pleas, despite every instinct that told them what they were doing was wrong. They sweated and trembled and protested, many of them clearly in agonizing moral distress. But when the man in the lab coat said, "The experiment requires that you continue," they continued. They obeyed. Milgram's findings had sent a shockwave through the field of psychology and through the broader culture, because they suggested something that most people found deeply threatening to their self-concept. That obedience to authority was not a rare pathology, but a deeply embedded feature of human social behavior, that the vast majority of people, when placed in a situation where a legitimate authority figure instructed them to harm another person, would do so, not because they were sadistic or psychopathic or morally deficient, but because the psychological mechanisms of obedience were simply that powerful, that the situation itself could override the individual's moral compass in ways that the individual could neither predict nor fully understand. And if this was true, then the comfortable distinction between us and them, between the decent people and the monsters, between the Americans who watched the evening news in horror and the soldiers who had pulled the triggers at My Lai, that distinction was far less stable than anyone wanted to admit. This was the intellectual landscape into which Philip Zimbardo stepped in the early 1970s, and to understand the Stanford prison experiment, you need to understand Zimbardo himself, because the experiment was in many ways a reflection of his personality, his ambitions, his particular genius, and his particular blind spots. Zimbardo was born in 1933 in the South Bronx of New York City, the son of Sicilian immigrants, and he had grown up in a neighborhood that was, by any measure, a difficult place. A place where poverty and crime and ethnic tensions were the fabric of daily life, where the line between those who ended up on one side of the law and those who ended up on the other was often determined not by character or moral fibre, but by circumstance, by luck, by the accident of which corner you happened to be standing on at the wrong moment. This early experience, this intimate knowledge of how environment shapes behaviour, how the same person can become a saint or a sinner, depending on the context in which they find themselves, would become the animating question of Zimbardo's entire career. He was not interested in the psychology of aberrant individuals, in the clinical study of psychopaths and sociopaths. He was interested in the psychology of situations, in the invisible forces that operate on normal people, and push them toward actions they would never have imagined themselves capable of. Zimbardo had earned his doctorate from Yale, where he had crossed paths with Milgram and been profoundly influenced by his work. He had arrived at Stanford in 1968, a young, charismatic, intellectually restless professor who wore his hair long and his sideburns thick in the style of the era, who drove a motorcycle and cultivated an image that was equal parts serious scientist and countercultural rebel, and who had quickly established himself as one of the most dynamic and ambitious members of the psychology department. By 1971, he was ready to make his mark, and the question he wanted to answer was one that went beyond Milgram, one that he believed Milgram's experiment, for all its brilliance, had left unresolved. Milgram had shown that people would obey a direct authority figure, but what happened when there was no direct authority figure issuing commands? What happened when you simply placed people in a social structure, gave them roles, and let the situation itself do the work? What happened when you took ordinary, psychologically healthy young men and arbitrarily divided them into two groups, one with power and one without, and then watched to see what emerged? Would the structure itself generate the behavior, or would individual character and moral reasoning prevail? This was the question that the Stanford prison experiment was designed to answer, and Zimbardo, with the confidence of a man who already suspected what the answer would be, set about designing a study that would test it in the most dramatic way possible. The first step was the advertisement, and if you had been a college student in the Palo Alto area in the summer of 1971, you might have come across it in the classified section of a local newspaper or pinned to a bulletin board in a campus building. It was brief, straightforward, and, in retrospect, almost absurdly understated given what it would lead to. Male college students needed for psychological study of prison life, it read. $15 per day. Adjusted for inflation, that $15 would be roughly equivalent to $110 today, a significant sum for a college student, enough to cover rent and groceries and perhaps a little extra, enough to make the opportunity attractive without seeming suspicious. The ad generated over 75 responses, which was more than Zimbardo and his team had anticipated, and the process of selecting participants began. The selection process was rigorous, far more rigorous than most people realize when they hear the story of the Stanford prison experiment for the first time, because this point is crucial to understanding everything that followed. Zimbardo did not want a random sample of the general population. He wanted the most psychologically normal, well-adjusted, healthy young men he could find, because the entire point of the experiment was to demonstrate that the situation, not the individual, was the primary driver of behavior. If the participants were psychologically unstable, if they had histories of violence or mental illness or antisocial behavior, then any disturbing results could be dismissed as the predictable actions of troubled individuals, and the experiment's central thesis would be undermined. So every one of the 70-plus respondents was subjected to a battery of psychological tests, personality assessments, clinical interviews, and background checks. They were screened for criminal history, for drug use, for medical conditions, for psychiatric disorders. They were evaluated for emotional stability, for maturity, for their ability to handle stress. Of the more than 75 applicants, only 24 were selected. The 24 who scored as the most psychologically stable, the most well-adjusted, the most normal by every metric available to psychology at the time. These were not damaged people. These were not people with a predisposition toward cruelty or a history of violence. These were, by every available measure, the cream of the crop, the golden boys, the kind of young men you would be happy to have as your neighbor, your classmate, your son. And this is what makes what happened next so deeply unsettling, because it strips away the comfortable fiction that cruelty requires a cruel person, that monstrous behavior requires a monster. The 24 selected participants were randomly assigned to one of two groups. The method was simple, almost laughably so given the weight of what it would determine: a coin flip. Heads, you are a guard. Tails, you are a prisoner. There was no screening for leadership qualities, no assessment of dominance or submissiveness, no effort to match personality types to roles. The assignment was pure chance, as arbitrary and meaningless as the toss of a quarter spinning in the air and landing on the back of a hand. And yet, this arbitrary assignment, this random division of 24 essentially identical young men into two groups, would within hours begin to create a gulf between them that felt as real and as deep as any division that has ever separated human beings from one another, because what the coin flip determined was not just a role in an experiment, but a position within a power structure, and power structures, even artificial ones, even ones that everyone involved knows are artificial, have a way of becoming real with astonishing speed. Half of the young men would be given authority, and half would have their authority taken away, and within a very short time the difference between these two experiences would begin to reshape not just their behavior, but their identities, their sense of self, the very way they perceived the world and their place in it. But before the experiment could begin, the stage had to be set, and Zimbardo approached this task with the meticulous attention of a theatre director staging a production, because in a very real sense that is exactly what he was doing. The basement corridor of Jordan Hall was transformed into a mock prison, with a level of detail that went far beyond what was strictly necessary for a psychological study. 3 small laboratory rooms were converted into prison cells, each one roughly 6 by 9 feet. barely large enough for the 3 cots that were placed inside, each cell sealed with a specially constructed door made of steel bars. Real steel bars, not painted wood or cardboard, bars that clanged when they closed and that could be locked with a real lock. At one end of the corridor, a small closet was designated as the hole, a solitary confinement cell so cramped that a person standing inside could barely extend their arms, a space that was dark and windowless and claustrophobic, designed to be punitive, designed to feel like punishment. There were no windows anywhere in the mock prison, no clocks, no way for the inhabitants to track the passage of time or to see the outside world. And this was deliberate because Zimbardo understood that disorientation, the loss of temporal and spatial anchors, was one of the most psychologically destabilizing experiences a person could undergo, and he wanted to replicate the conditions of an actual prison as faithfully as possible. A small room at the end of the corridor was designated as the guards' quarters, a space where the guards could relax between shifts, a space that had amenities, light, comfort, all the things the prisoners would be denied, and this contrast, this stark division between the haves and the have-nots, was itself part of the experimental design. The attention to detail extended to the participants themselves, and here is where Zimbardo's theatrical instincts are most clearly visible, because he understood, perhaps intuitively, perhaps from his reading of the sociological literature on total institutions, that the transformation of a free person into a prisoner does not happen all at once, but is accomplished through a series of deliberate rituals designed to strip away the individual's identity and replace it with an institutional one. The prisoners would not simply be told they were prisoners and asked to sit in their cells. They would be processed, broken down, remade. And the process would begin not in the basement of Jordan Hall but on the quiet, tree-lined streets of Palo Alto, in the most dramatic and disorienting way Zimbardo could devise. On the morning of August 14th, 1971, a Sunday, a day chosen because the streets would be quiet and the spectacle would be all the more jarring for its incongruity with a peaceful suburban setting, real Palo Alto police officers, actual uniformed officers driving actual squad cars, arrived at the homes of the young men who'd been assigned to the prisoner group. Zimbardo had arranged this collaboration with the Palo Alto Police Department, and the officers had agreed to participate with what appears to have been a combination of curiosity and amusement, treating it as an unusual but not unwelcome break from their normal routine. The arrests were unannounced. The young men had been told that the experiment would begin sometime during the week of August 14th, but they had not been told exactly when or how. So when a police cruiser pulled up to a young man's apartment on a quiet Sunday morning, and when 2 uniformed officers stepped out and approached his front door, and when they informed him that he was being arrested on suspicion of armed robbery or burglary, the shock was real, even if the charges were not. Neighbours came to their windows and their front porches to watch. Some of the young men were arrested in front of their families, their parents, their girlfriends. They were read their Miranda rights, the same rights that are read to every suspect in America, the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, the familiar litany that everyone has heard on television, but that sounds entirely different when it is being directed at you. When the handcuffs are clicking shut around your wrists and the neighbours are staring, and a part of your mind is saying this is just an experiment, this is just a study, this is not real, while another part, a deeper, more primitive part, is responding to the uniforms and the authority and the cold metal on your skin, and the feeling of being led to a car with your hands behind your back, and that deeper part does not care about consent forms and daily stipends. That deeper part simply knows that it has been captured. The young men were placed in the back seats of the patrol cars and driven to the Palo Alto police station, where they were brought inside and booked just as any actual criminal suspect would be. They were fingerprinted, their fingers pressed one by one into the ink pad, and then rolled onto the booking card, leaving behind the world evidence of their unique identities that were about to be systematically erased. They were photographed, the flashbulb catching their expressions of bewilderment and anxiety, faces that had not yet learned to compose themselves into the blank mask that prisoners everywhere eventually adopt as a survival mechanism. They were made to stand against the wall with booking numbers held beneath their chins, and in those photographs you can see the beginning of something, a subtle shift in the eyes, a dawning recognition that this experience was going to be something other than what they had imagined when they circled the newspaper ad and picked up the telephone. After the booking process was complete, each prisoner was blindfolded, a strip of cloth tied firmly over his eyes, cutting off his visual connection to the world, making him dependent on the hands that guided him, the voices that directed him, unable to see where he was being taken or to orient himself in space. The blindfold served a practical purpose, preventing the prisoners from seeing the route to the mock prison, and thus maintaining the illusion that they were in a real correctional facility. But they also served a psychological one, because to be blindfolded is to be rendered helpless in the most fundamental way, to be placed at the mercy of those who can see, to be reduced from a subject who acts upon the world to an object that is acted upon. The blindfolded prisoners were driven from the police station to the basement of Jordan Hall, a journey of only a few minutes, but a journey that, for the young men sitting in darkness in the back seats of those cars, felt like a passage between worlds, a crossing of a threshold beyond which the familiar rules of their lives no longer applied. When the prisoners arrived at the mock prison, they were led inside one by one, still blindfolded, and the process of transformation accelerated. Each prisoner was stripped naked, made to stand exposed and vulnerable in the harsh fluorescent light while strangers looked on, and this was not incidental but essential, because nakedness in front of clothed observers is one of the most ancient and effective tools of domination, a practice that has been used in prisons and military stockades and detention facilities throughout history, precisely because of its power to humiliate, to reduce a person to their bare animal existence, to demonstrate in the most visceral way possible that the institution now controls everything, including the most intimate boundaries of the body. The prisoners were then sprayed with a delousing agent, a powdered substance applied to their bodies as if they were infested, as if they were unclean, as if they carried contamination that needed to be eradicated before they could be admitted into the institutional population, and while the delousing was a simulation, the humiliation it produced was not. Each prisoner was then given his uniform, and the word uniform is used here with deliberate irony, because the garment the prisoners received was not a uniform in any traditional sense, but a smock, a coarse, shapeless, dress-like garment that fell to mid-thigh, a garment that looked like nothing so much as a hospital gown or a child's nightshirt. And this too was deliberate, because Zimbardo understood that clothing is identity, that the clothes we wear are among the most powerful signals we send to the world and to ourselves about who we are, and that to take away a man's clothes and replace them with a shapeless feminizing smock was to attack his sense of selfhood at its most basic level. The smocks had no underwear beneath them. The prisoners wore the smocks and nothing else, which meant that every time they moved, every time they sat down or stood up or bent over, they were aware of their vulnerability, their exposure, the absence of the simple dignity that underwear provides. Each prisoner was also given a number printed on the front and back of his smock, and from that point forward, this number would be his only identity within the prison. He would not be addressed by his name. The guards would not use his name. The other prisoners would be discouraged from using his name. He was no longer a person with a history and a family and a collection of memories and preferences and quirks that made him unique. He was a number, a unit within a system, interchangeable with any other unit. And this stripping of names, this replacement of identity with numerical designation, is another technique borrowed directly from the practices of real penal and military institutions, a technique whose psychological effects are well documented. When you take away a person's name, you take away the primary linguistic anchor of their selfhood, the word that has been associated with their being since before they can remember, the word their mother used to call them in from the yard, the word their friends shout across a crowded room, and without that anchor, the self begins to drift, to become pliable, to accept the identity that the institution assigns in place of the one that has been taken away. Additionally, a heavy chain was locked around each prisoner's right ankle, a real chain, not a prop, a chain that was heavy enough to be felt with every step, heavy enough to clink and drag against the floor, heavy enough to be impossible to forget even for a moment. The chain was there to serve as a constant physical reminder of captivity, an unremitting sensory signal that said, "You are not free, you are constrained, you are under someone else's control." The prisoners would wear these chains 24 hours a day, sleeping with them, eating with them, shuffling to the bathroom with them, and over time the chains would become a part of them, an extension of their new identity, a weight they would feel even after it was removed, a phantom shackle on a phantom limb. And then there were the stocking caps, nylon stockings cut and knotted to form tight-fitting caps that the prisoners wore over their hair, simulating the shaved heads that are standard practice in many prisons and military inductions, another ritual of identity erasure. Because hair, like clothing, is one of the primary ways in which people express their individuality, and to cover it, to make every head look the same, is to take one more step toward the homogenization of the group, the dissolution of the individual into the mass. The young men who stood in that basement corridor on that first afternoon, wearing their shapeless smocks and their stocking caps and their ankle chains, identified only by the numbers printed on their chests, looked nothing like the confident, healthy, psychologically stable college students who had answered a newspaper ad a few weeks earlier. They looked, already, like prisoners. The guards, by contrast, were given uniforms that conferred authority and anonymity in equal measure. Each guard received a khaki shirt and khaki pants, the quasi-military clothing of institutional authority, a uniform that said, "I am not an individual, I am a representative of the system. I speak and act not for myself, but for the structure that has placed me in this position." Each guard was given a wooden baton, a billy club that served no practical purpose within the experiment, since the guards were explicitly prohibited from using physical violence against the prisoners, but the batons were not there to be used. They were there to be seen. They were there to be held, to be tapped against a palm, to be carried at the hip, because a baton is a symbol, a condensed representation of the state's monopoly on legitimate violence. And merely carrying one changes the way a person holds his body, straightens his spine, squares his shoulders, alters his gait from the casual stride of a civilian to the measured, purposeful walk of someone who carries the implicit threat of force. And then, perhaps most importantly, there were the mirrored sunglasses. Each guard was given a pair of reflective aviator sunglasses, the kind that show the observer nothing but his own distorted reflection when he looks into them. And these sunglasses were Philip Zimbardo's most inspired and most sinister contribution to the experiment's design. The sunglasses served a specific psychological function. They prevented the prisoners from making eye contact with the guards, from seeing the guards' eyes, and eye contact is one of the most fundamental mechanisms of human empathy and social connection. When you look into another person's eyes, you see them as a person, as a being with an interior life, with thoughts and feelings and fears that mirror your own, and this recognition, this seeing of the other, is one of the primary inhibitors of cruelty. It is much harder to hurt someone whose eyes you can see. The mirrored sunglasses removed this inhibitor. They turned the guards' faces into blank reflective surfaces, masks that revealed nothing, that gave the prisoners nothing to appeal to, no human being behind the authority, just the cold, mirrored image of their own diminished selves staring back at them. Zimbardo understood that de-individuation, the process by which people lose their sense of individual identity and personal responsibility when submerged in a group or concealed behind a mask or a uniform, was one of the most powerful catalysts of antisocial behavior, and the sunglasses were designed to accelerate that process, to make it easier for the guards to stop seeing themselves as individuals who were choosing to act in certain ways and to start seeing themselves as guards, as functionaries, as embodiments of a role that came with its own set of expectations and permissions. The rules of the prison were established, a set of regulations that the prisoners were required to memorize and recite, and that governed every aspect of their daily lives. There were rules about when they could eat, when they could sleep, when they could use the bathroom. There were rules about how they were to address the guards, always with the word Mr. followed by the guard's title, never by name, a linguistic convention that reinforced the hierarchy by encoding it into every verbal interaction. There were rules about maintaining silence during rest periods, about keeping the cells clean, about lining up for count 3 times a day, the regular head counts during which the prisoners were required to stand at attention and recite their numbers and demonstrate their knowledge of the rules, rituals that served no practical purpose, but that existed solely to remind everyone, guards and prisoners alike, of the power structure within which they were all operating. The rules were deliberately extensive and deliberately petty, because petty rules are the hallmark of total institutions everywhere, from prisons to boot camps to boarding schools, institutions that seek to control not just the major actions of their inhabitants, but the minor ones as well, the way they stand, the way they speak, the way they hold their hands, because total control over the small things is the surest demonstration of total control over everything. And so, on that afternoon in August of 1971, the experiment began. The guards took their positions, the prisoners stood in their cells, and for the first few hours the prevailing atmosphere was not one of cruelty or fear or submission, but of uncertainty, awkwardness, the strange self-consciousness of people who know they are playing a part but have not yet figured out how to play it. There was nervous laughter. The kind of laughter that surfaces when a situation is too strange to process through any other emotional channel. The laughter of young men who are standing in a basement wearing dresses and chains and stocking caps on their heads, facing other young men they might have sat next to in a lecture hall or shared a beer with at a party. Young men who are now wearing khaki uniforms and mirrored sunglasses and carrying wooden batons, and everyone can see the absurdity of it, can feel the theatrical artificiality of the arrangement. And for a little while, this awareness provides a kind of protective irony, a buffer between the participants and their roles. A voice in the back of each mind that says, "This is not real. We are just pretending. We are college students in a basement, and in 2 weeks this will be over, and we will go back to our normal lives, and we will have an interesting story to tell, and a few $100 in our pockets, and that will be that." The guards were not sure how authoritative to be. Some of them gave orders in tones that were almost apologetic, as if embarrassed by the power they had been handed, as if asking for permission to exercise the authority that had been assigned to them. The prisoners were not sure how submissive to be. Some of them cracked jokes, trying to establish a rapport with the guards, trying to maintain the social equality that had existed between them just hours earlier, before the coin flip, before the uniforms, before the numbers and the chains. There was a tentativeness to those first hours, a sense that the roles were costumes that could be put on and taken off at will, that the power structure was a game that everyone had agreed to play, and that everyone could agree to stop playing at any moment. But even in those first hours, even amid the laughter and the uncertainty and the self-conscious awkwardness, something was beginning to shift, a change so subtle that it would have been almost impossible to detect if you were not looking for it, a change that was happening not in any individual person, but in the space between people, in the invisible web of social expectations and perceived permissions that connects every person in a social structure to every other person. The guards were beginning to discover something about their role that they had not anticipated. It felt good. Not good in a crude, sadistic sense. Not the pleasure of inflicting pain. Not yet. But good in the way that competence feels good, in the way that authority feels good. The quiet satisfaction of giving an order and having it obeyed. The subtle rush of standing while others sit. Of speaking while others listen. Of moving freely through a space while others are confined. It is a feeling that anyone who has ever held even the smallest amount of institutional authority will recognize. The feeling of being the one with the keys, the one who decides, the one whose word carries weight, and it is a feeling that is very, very difficult to relinquish once you have tasted it. And the prisoners, for their part, were beginning to discover something about their role that they had not anticipated either. It felt real. The smocks felt real. The chains felt real. The numbers felt real. The locked doors and the barred cells and the absence of windows and the guards' mirrored eyes that gave back nothing but your own reflection. It all felt real in a way that the consent form and the daily stipend and the knowledge that you could leave at any time could not entirely counteract. Because the body does not read consent forms, the nervous system does not understand the concept of a voluntary study. And when your body is confined and your identity is stripped and your autonomy is curtailed, the physiological and psychological responses that are triggered are the same ones that would be triggered in an actual prison, the same ones that have been triggered in every captive human being throughout the long, dark history of captivity, and no amount of intellectual understanding can fully override them. The first count took place that evening, and it was a mundane affair, the guards calling the prisoners out of their cells and lining them up in the corridor, and having them recite their numbers, a process that took only a few minutes and that, on the surface, appeared to be nothing more than an administrative formality. But even this small ritual was doing its work, because rituals are the mechanisms through which social structures reproduce themselves, the means by which abstract power relations are made concrete and embodied and felt, and each time a prisoner stepped out of his cell and stood at attention and recited his number, he was not merely complying with a rule, but participating in the construction of a reality in which he was a prisoner, and the man with the clipboard and the sunglasses was a guard, and the more he participated, the more real it became, not because he believed it intellectually, but because he was living it physically, because the body's experience of confinement and subordination does not require intellectual belief to produce its effects, just as a placebo does not require the patient's knowledge of its inertness to produce physiological changes. The count ended. The prisoners returned to their cells, the guards returned to their station. The lights were dimmed for the night, though not extinguished entirely, because in prison, Even in a mock prison, there is no true darkness, no moment of complete privacy, no place where the institution's gaze does not reach. And as the first night settled over the basement of Jordan Hall, as the young men lay on their thin mattresses in their narrow cells, some of them staring at the ceiling, some of them whispering to their cellmates, some of them already feeling the first stirrings of an anxiety they could not name, the experiment was barely 12 hours old, and already the world it had created was beginning to develop its own gravity, its own internal logic, its own momentum. No one had been hurt, no one had been humiliated beyond the initial processing. No rules had been broken, no boundaries crossed, no lines transgressed. By any objective measure, nothing remarkable had happened at all. And yet, in the way the guards held their batons, in the way the prisoners hunched their shoulders, in the way the silence in the corridor felt different from the silence in any ordinary hallway, in the almost imperceptible shift in the way these young men looked at each other and spoke to each other and occupied space in each other's presence, you could feel it. The way you can feel a change in barometric pressure before a storm, not seeing anything different, not hearing anything different, but sensing in your bones that something is coming. The structure was in place, the roles had been assigned, the costumes had been donned and the stage had been set and the actors had taken their positions, and now the play was about to begin in earnest, and it would be a play without a script, a performance in which the actors would discover their lines only by speaking them. A drama that would unfold not according to anyone's design or intention, but according to the deep, ancient, terrifying logic of power and submission, and the human capacity for both that lives in every one of us, waiting, always waiting, just beneath the surface. By the end of the first day, the seeds had been planted. By the end of the second day, they would begin to grow. And by the end of the sixth day, the experiment would be over, not because the 2 weeks had elapsed, not because the data had been collected, not because the hypothesis had been confirmed, but because what was happening in that basement had become so disturbing, so far beyond what anyone had anticipated or prepared for, that it could no longer be allowed to continue, and the man who had designed it, the man who had built the prison, and written the rules, and chosen the sunglasses, and orchestrated the arrests, Philip Zimbardo himself, would be forced to confront the possibility that the monster he had been studying was not confined to his experimental subjects, that it had been inside him all along, growing quietly in the fertile soil of his own authority, his own role, his own unchecked power, and that the most important lesson of the Stanford prison experiment was not what it revealed about guards and prisoners, but what it revealed about the man who watched it all unfold and did nothing to stop it for 6 long, unconscionable days. But that is a story for later. For now, in the basement of Jordan Hall, the lights are dim, the cells are locked. The chains clink softly as the prisoners shift on their cots. The guards sit in their quarters playing cards, and the night stretches out ahead of them, and no one, not the prisoners, not the guards, not Zimbardo himself, has any idea what is about to happen. The only sound is the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the occasional clank of a chain, and somewhere, faintly, the sound of someone breathing in the dark. Within 24 hours, the basement of Jordan Hall had already begun to feel like a place that existed outside the normal flow of time, a place where clocks meant nothing, and the fluorescent lights never dimmed, and the air carried the faint chemical smell of institutional cleaning fluid mixed with something else, something harder to name, something that might have been the earliest traces of fear beginning to seep from human pores and settle into the concrete walls like a stain that would never fully wash away. The first night had passed in restless confusion, the prisoners tossing on their thin mattresses, their smocks riding up around their hips, their ankle chains clinking softly each time they shifted position, the small persistent weight of the chain a constant reminder, even in the borderlands of sleep, that they were not who they had been just hours before. They were numbers now, they answered to numbers, and somewhere in the back corridors of their minds, in those deep places where identity lives and breathes and fights for survival, something was already beginning to shift, to crack, to reorganize itself around a new and terrible understanding of what it means to be stripped of everything that makes you you. But the first night was merely the overture. The real descent, the plunge into the darkest waters of human psychology, began on the morning of day 2, when the prisoners woke to the sound of a guard's whistle shrieking through the corridor and realized, with a dawning horror that settled into their stomachs like cold metal, that this was not going to end the way they had imagined. This was not going to be a story they would tell at parties, a quirky anecdote about the time they spent a couple of weeks pretending to be inmates for $15 a day. This was going to be something else entirely, something that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The first cracks appeared in prisoner 8612, a young man whose real name was Douglas Corpy, though his real name had already begun to feel like an artifact from another lifetime, a word that belonged to a person who existed somewhere on the other side of the locked door at the end of the corridor, a person who went to classes and ate in dining halls and had opinions about music and politics and the war in Vietnam. Down here, in the artificial twilight of the Stanford County Jail, he was 8612, and 8612 was beginning to unravel. It started with agitation, a restless energy that manifested as pacing within his cell, his chain dragging across the floor in a rhythmic scrape that set the other prisoners' teeth on edge. Then came the arguments with the guards, small at first, pushback against the rules that had seemed merely absurd the day before, but now felt suffocating, oppressive, designed with surgical precision to strip away every last shred of autonomy. He refused to do his push-ups during count. He talked back when a guard told him to stand straight. He looked the guards in the eyes when he spoke, which by the unwritten rules of the experiment had already become an act of defiance, a violation of the invisible hierarchy that was crystallizing with frightening speed in the recycled air of that basement. And then, sometime during the second day, something inside Douglas Corpy broke, not bent, not strained, broke, and the sound of it breaking was the sound of a young man screaming at the top of his lungs in a concrete corridor, screaming with a rawness and a desperation that made the other prisoners go silent in their cells, screaming words that tumbled over each other in a cascade of panic and rage and genuine, unperformable anguish. He screamed that he wanted out. He screamed that he could not take it anymore. He screamed that something was wrong with him, that he was falling apart, that he could feel his mind coming loose from its moorings like a boat torn free in a storm. He pounded on the walls of his cell with his fists until his knuckles split and left small smears of blood on the concrete, and still he kept screaming, his voice cracking and breaking and rebuilding itself just to break again. The other prisoners heard every sound. The walls were thick enough to muffle conversation, but not thick enough to contain that kind of raw human distress. They lay on their mattresses or sat with their backs against the wall, and they listened to 8612 coming apart. And something happened in each of them as they listened. Something subtle but profound, a recalibration of their understanding of where they were and what was happening to them. Because if this was just an experiment, if this was just a study being conducted by a psychology professor at one of the most prestigious universities in the country, then why did it sound like that? Why did it sound like a man being destroyed? The screaming did something to the prisoners that no amount of rule enforcement or whistleblowing or forced push-ups could have accomplished. It planted the seed of a terrible question in their minds, a question that would grow and spread its roots through everything that followed. What if we cannot actually leave? What if the consent forms and the daily payments and the promise that this was temporary were just another layer of the experiment, another wall in the prison, invisible but just as solid as the concrete? This question, once planted, proved almost impossible to uproot, and it became the fertile soil in which every subsequent horror would grow. And then the rebellion came. It was not organized in the way that real prison rebellions are organized, with leaders and plans and clearly articulated demands, because these were not real prisoners with years of institutional experience and networks of loyalty forged in the yard. These were college students who 48 hours ago had been free young men with the world spread out before them, like a map full of possibility. But something primal rose up in them, something that preceded language and strategy, something that simply said no, not like this, not one more minute like this. The prisoners in several cells began to push their beds against their doors, barricading themselves inside, creating the only barrier they could between themselves and the guards who had begun to feel less like fellow students playing a role, and more like something genuinely threatening. Something with real power and a growing appetite for its use. They ripped off their stocking caps, those humiliating nylon substitutes for shaved heads, and they tore at their smocks, and they shouted through the doors, and for a brief wild moment it must have felt like freedom, like reclaiming some small territory of selfhood in a landscape that had been systematically stripped bare. The guards' response was swift and it was disproportionate, and it revealed something about the speed at which ordinary people can escalate from rule enforcement to genuine cruelty when they believe they have the authority to do so, and no one above them is saying stop. They called in reinforcements from the other shifts, assembling a force that outnumbered the prisoners, and then they went to work. They grabbed the fire extinguishers from the walls and they turned them on the prisoners, blasting them with the cold chemical spray through the bars of their cells, the carbon dioxide fog filling the small spaces and making the prisoners cough and choke and stumble backward from the doors. Then they forced their way in. They dragged the beds out of the cells. They stripped the prisoners naked. They stood them against the wall and they conducted a count, and the count was different now. The count had a new edge to it, a new energy that crackled in the air like static before a storm. The ringleaders, the prisoners who had been identified as the primary instigators of the rebellion, were pulled from the group and taken to solitary confinement, which was not a cell at all, but a closet. A tiny dark closet barely large enough for a person to stand in, and they were locked inside in the darkness and left there. Imagine it! Close your eyes and put yourself in that closet for just a moment. You're standing in darkness so complete that you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. The air is close and stale and warm with your own breath. The walls are near enough to touch on all sides without fully extending your arms. Your ankle chain presses against your skin. You're naked. And you can hear, muffled through the door, the sounds of the count continuing without you, the guards' voices sharp and commanding, the other prisoners responding with their numbers, the whole machinery of the experiment grinding forward as if you had never existed at all. This is the closet. This is the hole. And you are inside it because you had the audacity to push a bed against a door and say no. What happened after the rebellion was crushed is perhaps even more revealing than the rebellion itself, because it demonstrated a principle that every tyrant in history has understood instinctively, a principle that does not need to be taught, because it seems to be wired into the deep architecture of human social behavior. The guards, having re-established control through force, immediately moved to ensure that future resistance would be impossible, and they did this not through increased physical force but through a far more elegant and devastating strategy. They turned the prisoners against each other. They created what they called the privilege cell. One of the 3 cells was designated as a reward, and the prisoners who had been least involved in the rebellion, the ones who had been most compliant, the ones who had kept their stocking caps on and their mouths shut while others barricaded doors and shouted defiance, were placed in this cell. They got their beds back. They got their clothes back. They were given special meals, better food than the standard bland fare that the other prisoners received. They were allowed to brush their teeth and wash. And the other prisoners, the ones who had rebelled, the ones who were now naked and bedless and still coughing from the fire extinguisher spray, could see all of this. They could see their fellow prisoners eating better food and sleeping on mattresses and wearing their smocks, and the effect was exactly what the guards intended. Suspicion bloomed like mold in a damp room. The prisoners began to wonder who among them was collaborating with the guards. They began to distrust each other. They began to see every small interaction through the lens of betrayal and self-preservation. The solidarity that had briefly flared during the rebellion, that momentary flame of collective resistance, was extinguished more thoroughly by the privilege cell than it ever could have been by the fire extinguishers. This is how systems of oppression sustain themselves. Not through constant force, which is expensive and exhausting, but through the strategic distribution of small privileges that transforms the oppressed into instruments of their own oppression. Give some of them slightly more than the others, and watch as the energy that might have been directed upward toward the guards is redirected sideways toward each other. It is a strategy as old as human civilization, and it works because it exploits something fundamental about the way we process fairness and threat, the way we calculate our own survival in environments of scarcity and danger. And then there was the guard who became known as John Wayne. His real name was Dave Eshelman, and before the experiment he was by all accounts an unremarkable young man, a student at Stanford with no history of violence, no criminal record, no diagnosed pathology, no dark secret lurking in his past that might have predicted what he would become when handed a pair of mirrored sunglasses and a uniform and the keys to a row of cells. But from the very first shift, something in Dave Eshelman responded to the role with a creativity and an enthusiasm that went far beyond what the experiment required, or what the other guards displayed. He invented a persona. He adopted a southern accent, thick and drawling, an accent borrowed from the sadistic prison warden in the film Cool Hand Luke, and he strutted through the corridor with a swagger that seemed to belong to someone who had been doing this for years. someone who had grown comfortable with power the way a hand grows comfortable in a well-worn glove. The other guards were performing their roles with varying degrees of commitment, some reluctantly, some with growing confidence, but Eshelman was not performing. Or perhaps more accurately, his performance had become so thorough, so immersive, so total, that the distinction between the performance and the performer had collapsed entirely, like a method actor who descends so deeply into character that the character becomes more real than the person who created it. He was John Wayne now, and John Wayne had ideas. The punishments he devised were not physically brutal in the way that punishments in real prisons can be brutal. There were no beatings, no electric shocks, no waterboarding. What Eshelman understood, perhaps intuitively, perhaps through some dark gift of imagination, was that the most effective punishments are the ones that attack dignity rather than flesh, the ones that make the victim complicit in their own degradation. He made the prisoners do push-ups, but not just ordinary push-ups. He would stand over them while they did the push-ups, or he would have other prisoners sit on the backs of the ones doing push-ups, or he would make them do push-ups until their arms shook and their faces pressed into the concrete floor and they collapsed. And then he would tell them to start again. He conducted the counts, those twice-daily rituals of roll call, but he transformed them from a simple administrative procedure into an instrument of psychological warfare. The counts that were supposed to take 10 minutes stretched to an hour, to 2 hours, to sessions that consumed entire blocks of time, the prisoners standing in the corridor reciting their numbers over and over, while Eshelman paced before them, correcting their posture, making them start over when someone stumbled over a number, inventing new requirements on the spot with the improvisational flair of a jazz musician playing in the key of cruelty. He began conducting counts at 2:30 in the morning, rousing the prisoners from whatever thin and troubled sleep they had managed to find, dragging them into the corridor in the dead of night to stand under the fluorescent lights and recite their numbers while their minds reeled with exhaustion and confusion. And perhaps most tellingly, he made them clean the toilets with their bare hands, not with brushes, not with sponges, with their bare hands, their fingers scraping against porcelain, the smell of it in their nostrils, the degradation of it settling into their understanding of themselves like a stain that no amount of future hand-washing would ever fully remove. This was the genius of John Wayne's cruelty. It was not about pain. Pain is temporary. It was about identity. It was about reaching inside a person and rearranging the furniture of their self-concept until they could no longer remember what the room had looked like before. And here we must pause, not in the narration, which flows onward like a dark river, but in our thinking, to ask the question that the Stanford prison experiment forces us to ask about Dave Eshelman and about ourselves. Was he a monster? Was there something lurking inside him all along, some sadistic predisposition that the experiment merely uncovered, the way an archaeologist's brush reveals a bone that was always there beneath the soil? Or was he something more frightening than a monster? Was he proof of a proposition so disturbing that most of us would rather not examine it too closely? The proposition that the capacity for this kind of behaviour exists in all of us, dormant and patient, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to call it forth? Zimbardo would later argue strenuously for the second interpretation, the situationist view, the idea that what happened in that basement was not the result of bad people doing bad things, but of a bad situation, transforming ordinary people into something they would not have recognized in the mirror. And there is evidence for this view, compelling evidence drawn not just from this experiment but from the broader landscape of human history, from the ordinary men who staffed the death camps of the Holocaust, from the neighbours who turned on neighbours in Rwanda, from the soldiers at Abu Ghraib who posed for photographs with their thumbs up, while human beings were stacked naked in pyramids at their feet. But there is also a counter-argument, a whisper that will not be silenced, which suggests that perhaps the truth is more complicated than either pure disposition or pure situation, that perhaps what the experiment revealed was not that anyone would have done what Eshelman did, but that within any group of people, there will be some who respond to power with restraint, and others who respond to it with hunger, and that the role of the situation is not to create the hunger from nothing, but to remove the social constraints that normally keep it hidden from view. The truth, as is so often the case with the deepest questions about human nature, probably lives somewhere in the uncomfortable space between these two positions, in a territory where simple answers go to die. Meanwhile, prisoner 8612, Douglas Corpy, was getting worse. His screaming had not stopped. It had evolved. It had moved beyond rage and protest into something qualitatively different, something that sounded less like a person demanding to be released, and more like a person losing the ability to organize their thoughts into coherent sequences. A person whose mind was fragmenting under pressure the way a windshield fragments when struck by a stone, the cracks spreading outward from the point of impact in an expanding web until the whole structure threatens to collapse into 1,000 glittering pieces. He cried. Not the quiet, controlled crying of an adult managing an emotion, but the raw, wrenching sobs of someone who has lost access to the internal mechanisms that normally regulate emotional expression, someone whose thermostat has broken, and whose furnace is running unchecked, flooding the house with unbearable heat. His thinking became disorganized. He would start a sentence and lose the thread halfway through, his words trailing off into silence or doubling back on themselves in loops that went nowhere. He told the guards he was sick. He told them he could not think straight. He told them something was wrong, really wrong, not pretend wrong, not experiment wrong, but wrong in the way that things are wrong when the machinery of the mind begins to malfunction, and the person inside the machinery can feel it happening but cannot make it stop. And here is where the story takes one of its most chilling turns, a turn that reveals how completely Philip Zimbardo himself had been absorbed by the situation he'd created. When Zimbardo first observed 8612's deterioration, his initial reaction was not concern for the young man's well-being, it was suspicion. He thought Corpy was faking. He thought, with the suspicious mind of a prison superintendent who has seen every trick in the book, that this prisoner was putting on a performance, manufacturing a breakdown in order to secure his release, gaming the system with a display of theatrical distress. Think about what this means. Think about what had happened inside Philip Zimbardo's mind in the space of less than 48 hours. A professor of psychology at Stanford University, a man whose entire career was built on understanding human behavior, a man who had designed this experiment specifically to study how situations shape behavior, was now so deeply embedded in his role as prison superintendent that he could look at a young man in genuine psychological distress and see not a research subject who needed help, but an inmate who needed to be watched more carefully. The experiment was studying the effects of institutional roles on behavior, and the most dramatic proof of its thesis was happening not in the cells, but in the mind of the principal investigator himself. Zimbardo had become his own most compelling data point, and he could not see it. This is the nature of role absorption. It does not announce itself. It does not send up flares or wave red flags. It creeps in through the back door of consciousness, rearranging your perceptions so gradually that you never notice the moment when the world you're looking at stops being the real world and starts being the world as seen through the eyes of the role you are playing. By the time you realize it has happened, if you ever realize it at all, the transformation is already complete. Eventually, after hours that must have felt like days to Douglas Corpy, Zimbardo and his research team acknowledged that the breakdown was real. They could see it in his eyes, which had taken on the glassy, unfocused quality of someone who is present in body, but whose mind has retreated to some internal bunker, some last redoubt of selfhood, where it is trying to hold the line against the forces bearing down on it from every direction. They could hear it in his voice, which had lost its performative quality and settled into the flat, affectless monotone of genuine psychological distress. They released him. Prisoner 8612 was let go from the experiment on the second day, less than 36 hours after it had begun. He walked out of the basement of Jordan Hall and back into the August sunlight, and one can only imagine what that transition must have felt like. The sudden explosion of light and space and air after the compressed darkness of the cells. The sound of normal life continuing all around him as if nothing had happened, as if the world had not fundamentally changed in the hours he had been underground. He was the first prisoner to leave, but he would not be the last. The experiment was consuming its participants one by one, and it had only just begun to feed. But even the removal of 8612 became part of the experiment's pathology, because it should have been a warning. It should have been the canary in the coal mine, the unmistakable signal that something had gone wrong, that the study had exceeded the boundaries of ethical research and entered territory where real harm was being done to real people. In any properly supervised experiment, the complete psychological breakdown of a participant within 36 hours would have triggered an immediate review, a pause, a reassessment of whether the study should continue, but no such review occurred. The experiment continued as if 8612's departure was merely a data point, an interesting development to be noted and analysed, not a crisis that demanded a fundamental rethinking of what was being done and why. And the reason it continued, the reason no one pulled the emergency brake, was that the people who had the power to stop it had been absorbed by the same situation they were supposed to be observing from the outside. Zimbardo was the superintendent. His graduate students were his staff. The guards were the guards. The prisoners were the prisoners. And the experiment had become a prison in the most literal and most metaphorical sense simultaneously. A structure that confined not just the bodies of the participants, but the minds of everyone involved, including and especially the minds of those who believed they were free. After the rebellion was crushed and 8,612 was removed, the experiment entered a new phase, a phase characterized not by dramatic confrontation, but by something more insidious, a slow, grinding erosion of identity and resistance that operated not through sudden shocks, but through the relentless accumulation of small degradations, each one trivial in isolation, but devastating in aggregate. The way that individual drops of water are harmless, but a river can carve a canyon through solid rock given enough time. The guards, emboldened by their success in putting down the rebellion and increasingly comfortable in their roles, began to refine their techniques. The punishments became more creative, more targeted, more psychologically precise. They had learned, in the space of just a few days, what professional interrogators and prison administrators take years to master. That the most effective way to break a person is not through violence, but through the systematic destruction of their sense of agency, their belief that their actions have consequences and their choices matter. When a prisoner was punished, it was often not clear what the punishment was for. The rules shifted constantly, capriciously, so that behaviour that was acceptable one hour would draw sanctions the next. This unpredictability was itself a form of punishment, perhaps the most devastating form of all, because it taught the prisoners that they had no control over their environment, that nothing they did or failed to do could reliably protect them from the guards' displeasure. This is a state that psychologists call learned helplessness, and it was first described by Martin Seligman in experiments with dogs who were subjected to inescapable electric shocks. The dogs, after learning that no action they took could stop the shocks, eventually stopped trying to escape even when escape became possible. They lay down on the electrified floor and whimpered. They had learned that their actions were meaningless, and this lesson, once learned, proved almost impossible to unlearn. The prisoners in the Stanford County Jail were learning the same lesson, and they were learning it with the same terrible efficiency. Then came the rumour that changed everything, or rather, that revealed how completely everything had already changed. Word reached Zimbardo that the prisoners were planning an escape. The details were vague, as rumours always are, something about prisoner 8612 returning with friends to break the remaining prisoners out of the facility, a jailbreak, a liberation. And Zimbardo's response to this rumour is perhaps the single most telling moment in the entire experiment, more revealing than anything that happened in the cells, or the corridor, or the solitary confinement closet, because it laid bare with absolute clarity the degree to which Philip Zimbardo had lost himself in the role of prison superintendent. His response was not to treat the rumour as data. It was not to sit back and observe how the guards and prisoners would react to the possibility of an escape, which would have been a fascinating addition to the study's findings. It was not to remind himself that this was an experiment, that these were college students, that the cells were unlocked from the outside and the prisoners could leave at any time simply by invoking their right to withdraw from the study. No, his response was to treat the rumour as a genuine security threat. He contacted the Palo Alto Police Department and attempted to arrange for all the prisoners to be transferred to the actual Palo Alto City Jail for safekeeping. He tried to move his research subjects into a real jail to prevent them from escaping from a fake one. When the police declined, he dismantled the entire experiment temporarily, moving all the prisoners to a different floor of the building and setting up an elaborate system of lookouts and preparations to foil the anticipated breakout. He spent hours on this, hours that could have been spent observing the experiment, analysing data, checking on the well-being of his participants. Instead, he spent them reinforcing the security of a prison that existed only because he had created it, and that he could dissolve with a single word. The irony is so thick you could choke on it. The man who designed an experiment to study how institutional roles warp behaviour could not see that his own behaviour had been warped beyond recognition by the institutional role he had assumed. He had become the thing he was studying. The observer had been swallowed by the observation. And still, impossibly, the experiment continued. There is a concept in psychology called cognitive dissonance, first described by Leon Festinger in the 1950s, and it helps explain how Zimbardo and his team could continue the experiment in the face of mounting evidence that it was causing genuine harm. Cognitive dissonance is the uncomfortable mental state that arises when a person holds two contradictory beliefs simultaneously, or when their actions conflict with their self-image. It creates a kind of psychological pressure, an internal discomfort that demands resolution, and the most common way people resolve it is not by changing their behavior to match their beliefs, but by changing their beliefs to match their behavior. Zimbardo believed he was a good person, an ethical researcher, a scientist dedicated to understanding and ultimately reducing human suffering. But his actions, the actions of the prison superintendent, were causing suffering. The dissonance between these two realities was enormous, and it could have been resolved by stopping the experiment, by acknowledging that things had gone too far and shutting it all down. But that resolution would have required Zimbardo to admit that he had been wrong, that he had lost control, that his judgment had been compromised, and so instead, the dissonance was resolved the other way. The belief shifted to accommodate the behavior. The suffering of the prisoners was reframed as necessary, as scientifically valuable, as something they had consented to and could end at any time, even though the evidence suggested that the prisoners no longer believed they could end it, that they had internalized their powerlessness so thoroughly that the option of withdrawal had become invisible to them, like a door painted to match the wall. And then there was visiting day. This was the day when the parents of the prisoners were allowed to come to the basement of Jordan Hall and see their sons, and Zimbardo's preparations for this visit reveal with devastating clarity how far down the rabbit hole he had fallen. He was worried. Not worried about the prisoners, not worried about the ethical implications of what the parents were about to see, but worried about how the prison would look. He was worried about appearances. He was worried that the parents would see through the facade and demand that their sons be released, which would compromise the experiment, which in his mind had become the most important thing, the thing that justified everything else, the thing that must be protected at all costs. And so he prepared. He had the prison cleaned, he had the prisoners shower and shave, he had them put on fresh smocks. He tried to make the prison look presentable, the way a warden prepares for an inspection, the way an institution puts on its best face when outsiders are coming to see what happens behind the walls. He even set up procedures for the visit that were designed to minimize the time parents spent with their children and to control the narrative of what was happening. The visits were short. They were supervised. They took place in carefully managed conditions that made it difficult for parents to fully grasp the reality of what their sons were experiencing. The parents came. They walked down the stairs into the basement and they saw their sons, and something passed across their faces. A shadow, a flicker of recognition that something was not right. That the young men standing before them in their wrinkled smocks with their hollow eyes and their numbered fronts were not quite the same young men who had left home just a few days ago, with the casual confidence of students heading off to participate in a summer research project. The prisoners looked haggard. They looked diminished. They looked like people who had been somewhere far away and had not yet fully returned. One mother, and this detail is so small and so devastating that it functions like a splinter in the mind. One mother looked at her son and barely recognized him. Not physically. He had not been beaten. He had not lost weight. He had not been disfigured. But something in his face had changed. Something in the way he held himself. Something in his eyes that was different from the eyes she had looked into 1,000 times across dinner tables and in rearview mirrors and in the first moments of morning when he was a child and the world was new and safe. She saw the change. She felt it in the way that parents feel things about their children, in that deep wordless knowing that operates below the threshold of conscious thought. And then she left. She left without demanding his release. She left without making a scene. She left without marching upstairs to Philip Zimbardo's office and telling him that whatever he was doing down there in that basement, it was over now, it was finished, and she was taking her son home. She left because the situation, the framing, the careful management of appearances, the authority of the institution, the implicit message that this was all normal, all under control, all part of the process, was powerful enough to override her own maternal instincts. She saw that something was wrong with her son and she left him there. And this, perhaps more than anything else that happened in the Stanford prison experiment, reveals the terrifying power of institutional authority to override individual judgment, to make the unacceptable seem acceptable, to convince ordinary people that what they are seeing is not what they are seeing, that the evidence of their own eyes and hearts is less reliable than the reassurances of the people in charge. Think about this. Think about how many layers of psychological manipulation are operating in this single scene. The mother has been primed by the cleanliness of the prison, by her son's freshly showered appearance, by the calm professionalism of the researchers, by the institutional prestige of Stanford University, by the implicit authority of a professor who surely knows what he is doing, by the social pressure of the other parents who are also visiting and also choosing not to make a scene, by the weight of her own desire to believe that her son is fine, that she's worrying over nothing, that this is just an experiment and it will be over soon and everything will go back to normal. All of these forces are pushing her toward compliance, toward acceptance, toward the decision to walk back up those stairs and drive home and wait for the experiment to end. And the only force pushing in the other direction is the evidence of her own perception, the subtle wrongness she detected in her son's face, the instinct that told her something was off. In the battle between institutional authority and individual perception, institutional authority won. It almost always wins. This is why prisons can operate for decades with conditions that would horrify the public if they were ever fully exposed. This is why hospitals can mistreat patients and schools can fail. Children and corporations can poison water supplies, and entire communities can know that something is wrong and still not act. Because the power of the institution to define reality, to determine what is normal and what is acceptable and what is just the way things are, is almost always stronger than the power of the individual to see through the definition and say, no, this is not normal, this is not acceptable, this is not just the way things are. The days ground on. The pattern that had been established in the first 48 hours deepened and solidified, the way a riverbed deepens and solidifies as the water continues to flow through it, the path becoming more defined, more entrenched, harder to deviate from with each passing hour. The guards grew more confident in their authority and more creative in their exercise of it. The late-night counts continued. The prisoners dragged from sleep at 2 and 3 in the morning to stand in the corridor and recite their numbers, their eyes glazed with exhaustion, their bodies swaying slightly as they stood, the fluorescent lights turning their skin a sickly greenish white that made them look less like living people and more like something you might find preserved in a jar in a medical museum. The push-ups continued, the toilet cleaning continued, the arbitrary punishments continued, and the prisoners, with each passing hour, became more compliant, more passive, more thoroughly institutionalized. They stopped talking about life outside the experiment. They stopped making plans for what they would do when it was over. They talked about prison matters, about the guards, about who was in trouble and who was in favor, about the rules and how to navigate them, about the small daily concerns of survival in a totalizing institution. The world outside, the world of sunshine and freedom and choice, had become abstract to them, theoretical, a place that existed in memory but no longer felt entirely real. This is the phenomenon that sociologists call total institution, a term coined by Irving Goffman in his landmark 1961 work Asylums. A total institution is a place where every aspect of life is conducted in the same place and under the same authority, where the individual's daily activities are carried out in the company of others who are all treated alike and required to do the same things together, where all phases of the day's activities are tightly scheduled, and the sequence of activities is imposed from above by a system of explicit formal rules and a body of officials. Prisons are total institutions, so are military boot camps, mental hospitals, monasteries and boarding schools. What Goffman observed about total institutions is that they work by systematically stripping away the supports that normally maintain a person's sense of self, the personal possessions, the private spaces, the individual routines, the social roles and relationships that together constitute what we think of as identity. In their place, the institution substitutes a new identity, one defined entirely by the institution's terms, and the process of this substitution, which Goffman called the mortification of self, follows a remarkably consistent pattern regardless of the specific institution involved. The Stanford prison experiment had replicated this pattern with uncanny precision, not because Zimbardo had designed it to, although his design certainly facilitated it. But because the dynamics of total institutions are so deeply embedded in human social behavior that they emerge spontaneously whenever the conditions are right, you do not need to train people to create a total institution. You just need to give some of them power over others, remove the external constraints that normally regulate behavior, and wait. The institution will build itself. The concept of de-individuation was also at work in that basement, threading through every interaction like an invisible current. De-individuation is the loss of self-awareness and individual accountability that occurs when a person becomes part of a group, particularly a group that provides anonymity and shared responsibility. The guards' mirrored sunglasses, which prevented the prisoners from making eye contact with them, were a powerful tool of de-individuation, creating a barrier between the guards' actions and the guards' identity, making it easier to do things that the person behind the sunglasses would never have done with their own naked face exposed to the judgment of others. But de-individuation was also operating on the prisoners, whose numbers and identical smocks and shaved or stocking-capped heads erased the visual markers of individual identity and submerged them in the anonymous mass of the prisoner population. When you cannot be distinguished from the people around you, when you have no name and no personal history and no distinguishing characteristics, something shifts in the way you relate to yourself and the way others relate to you. You become less real, both to yourself and to others. You become easier to mistreat because mistreating a number is psychologically simpler than mistreating a person with a name and a face, and a mother who barely recognized him during visiting day. This is why militaries put their soldiers in uniforms and their enemies in dehumanizing categories. This is why executioners wear hoods. This is why lynch mobs operate at night. The erasure of individual identity does not just enable cruelty. It creates a psychological space in which cruelty becomes almost frictionless, a space where the normal inhibitions that prevent us from harming each other are dissolved like sugar in hot water, leaving nothing behind but the sweet dark taste of unchecked power. By the end of day 4, the Stanford County Jail had become something that no one, not Zimbardo, not the guards, not the prisoners, not the university administrators who had approved the study, could have predicted or fully understood while it was happening. It had become a genuine institution, with its own culture, its own norms, its own hierarchy, its own rituals, its own language. The guards had developed a sophisticated system of social control that used a combination of unpredictable punishment, strategic reward, sleep deprivation, and constant surveillance to maintain order and suppress resistance. The prisoners had developed the coping strategies of real inmates, strategies that ranged from complete compliance to emotional withdrawal to identification with the aggressor. Some prisoners had begun to side with the guards, enforcing rules on their fellow prisoners with a zeal that exceeded what the guards themselves demanded. Others had retreated into themselves, becoming quiet and passive and nearly invisible, their eyes downcast, their movements small and careful, their entire being oriented toward the single goal of avoiding attention, of getting through each moment without being noticed. Still others were beginning to show signs of the same kind of breakdown that had claimed 8,612, the cracks spreading through their psychological defenses with each sleepless night and each degrading count and each hour spent in the knowledge that the people who had power over them could not be reasoned with, could not be appealed to, could not be predicted or controlled or escaped. And outside the basement, the sun continued to rise and set over the Stanford campus. Students walked to and from classes, professors held office hours, squirrels chased each other through the eucalyptus trees. The world continued in its ordinary rhythms, oblivious to the fact that in a basement beneath one of its buildings, in a corridor lit by fluorescent lights that never turned off, a group of young men who had walked in as equals were being systematically transformed into oppressors and oppressed, into guards and prisoners, into people they did not recognize and would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. The distance between that sunlit campus and that basement corridor was measured in feet, but experienced in light years. It was the distance between the world as we believe it to be and the world as it actually is, when the constraints that hold our better angels in place are removed, and we are left alone with our power or our powerlessness, in a room with no windows and a clock that seems to have stopped. That is where the Stanford prison experiment lived, in that gap between who we think we are and who we become when no one is watching. Or worse, when everyone is watching, and no one is saying stop. By the time the fluorescent lights flickered on to mark the 5th morning, something fundamental had shifted in the basement of Jordan Hall. something that could not be measured by any instrument the researchers had brought with them, something that lived in the eyes of the young men behind the bars and in the posture of the young men holding the keys. The gap between performance and identity, between playing a role and becoming that role, had narrowed to nothing, had closed like a wound healing over a foreign object, sealing something terrible beneath the skin where it could no longer be seen or extracted without cutting. The prisoners no longer spoke about the experiment. They did not reference their classes, their girlfriends, their apartments off campus, the lives they had been living just 5 days earlier when they were undergraduate students at one of the most prestigious universities in the world. Those identities had become ghostly, translucent, like photographs left too long in the sun, and what remained was something far more elemental, far more ancient, something that understood only the rhythm of counts and meals and the sound of footsteps approaching in the corridor. When they spoke to one another, they used their numbers, not as a joke, not with the self-conscious irony that had flavoured their first attempts at compliance, but with the flat and unremarkable acceptance of men who had simply forgotten that they had ever been called anything else. They sat on their cots with their backs against the wall and their legs drawn up and their arms wrapped around their knees, and they stared at the floor, or at the ceiling, or at nothing at all. And if you had walked into that basement without knowing what it was, without knowing that these were volunteers in a psychology study being paid $15 a day, you would have seen prisoners. Not students pretending to be prisoners, not young men performing captivity for the sake of science, but prisoners in the truest and most devastating sense of the word, human beings who had been stripped of every external marker of autonomy and had internalized that stripping so completely that they no longer reached for what had been taken. They asked permission to use the restroom. They asked permission to eat. They flinched when a guard raised his voice, and they did not flinch the way an actor flinches when following stage directions. They flinched the way a body flinches when it has learned through repetition that a raised voice precedes something painful. The transformation was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was quiet and thorough and complete, the way water saturates a sponge, filling every available space until there is no room left for air, until the original structure is still technically present but has become something else entirely, something heavy and waterlogged and unrecognizable. And perhaps the most unsettling detail of all was that the prisoners had stopped talking about leaving. In the first days, leaving had been a constant topic, a lifeline they held between them, the shared understanding that this was temporary, that the door was not truly locked, that they could walk away whenever they chose. But by the 5th morning that conversation had died, not because they had been forbidden from having it, but because the cognitive architecture that would have supported it, the framework of self that understood choice and agency, and the fundamental voluntariness of their situation had been quietly dismantled, brick by brick until the foundation was gone and there was nothing left to build upon. They were prisoners, and prisoners do not simply decide to leave. That is not how the world works when you're wearing a smock with a number on it and a chain on your ankle, and you have not seen sunlight in days, and the people who control every aspect of your existence carry whistles and wear mirrored sunglasses even in the dimness of a basement corridor. The world becomes very small in such circumstances, and the smallness feels not like a temporary condition but like a permanent truth, as though the world has always been this size, as though there was never anything beyond the walls. It was into this atmosphere, this dense and suffocating stillness, that a visitor arrived on the 5th day, a man who was not a researcher or a student or a parent, but a prison chaplain, a real chaplain who ministered to real inmates in real correctional facilities, a man who had spent years walking the tiers of actual penitentiaries and sitting across from actual convicts in actual visiting rooms. The 38-year-old professor with the dark curly hair and the wire-rimmed aviator glasses had invited him as a consultant, as a way of assessing how realistic the simulation had become, and the chaplain had agreed, perhaps expecting to find something theatrical, something that smelled of make-believe, college students hamming it up for extra credit or pocket money. But that is not what he found. He found young men who spoke in the flat, guarded monotone of the institutionalized. He found young men who avoided eye contact with authority figures, and who sat with the hunched and diminished posture of people who have learned to make themselves small. He interviewed them individually, sitting across from them in the cramped space of the consultation room, and he asked them questions and they answered. And in their answers he heard something that he recognized, something that he had heard 1,000 times before in the visiting rooms of San Quentin and Soledad and Folsom. He heard resignation. He heard the particular quality of hopelessness that belongs to people who have been inside long enough to forget what outside feels like. And when the chaplain emerged from these interviews, he did not say that the simulation was impressive or convincing or well-designed. He said that those young men were suffering the way real prisoners suffer. He said that they spoke and moved and thought like inmates, not like students. And then he did something that revealed just how completely the illusion had permeated even the consciousness of an outside observer. A man with years of professional experience who should have been immune to the theatre of it all. He offered to help them contact a lawyer, not a pretend lawyer, not a role-played legal advocate who would participate in the fiction, but an actual attorney who could file actual motions for their release. A prison chaplain, a man whose entire professional life was spent inside the reality of incarceration, looked at these undergraduate volunteers and saw prisoners who needed legal representation. The simulation had become so real that reality itself could no longer distinguish the copy from the original, and that confusion, that collapse of the boundary between what is performed and what is true, was perhaps the most damning piece of evidence the experiment would produce. More damning than any data set, more revealing than any questionnaire or behavioral observation, because it demonstrated that the power of a total institution does not depend on the authenticity of its walls or the legitimacy of its authority. It depends only on the willingness of human beings to believe, and human beings, it turns out, are almost always willing. As the fifth day wore on, and the hours accumulated like sediment at the bottom of a slow river, the guards entered a new phase of their own transformation, one that the 21-year-old with the sandy blonde hair and the cold, pale blue eyes had been approaching since the second day, but that now spread outward from him like a contagion, infecting even the guards who had initially been moderate, even the ones who had told themselves that they were just doing a job, just following the protocol, just maintaining order. The counts, those ritualistic roll calls that punctuated the prisoner's existence with metronomic regularity, had evolved from administrative exercises into elaborate performances of dominance, and on the fifth day they took on a character that was explicitly and unmistakably sexual. The prisoners were made to do push-ups, which had been a punishment from the beginning, but now the push-ups were accompanied by instructions that transformed them into simulated sexual acts. One prisoner forced to straddle another, their bodies arranged in configurations that were designed not to cause physical pain but to cause something deeper, something that lived in the intersection of shame and powerlessness and the fundamental violation of bodily autonomy. The guards laughed. They laughed the way people laugh when they have discovered a new source of entertainment, when the novelty of cruelty has not yet worn off, and the feedback loop between power and pleasure is still accelerating, still climbing towards some peak that has not yet been reached and perhaps cannot be reached, because the appetite it feeds grows faster than any single act can satisfy. And it is worth pausing here, in this dark and difficult passage of the story, to notice something about timing, because the most extreme behaviours did not occur during the daytime hours when the research team was most visibly present and the cameras were most obviously recording. They occurred at night. They occurred during the small hours of the morning, during the shifts that ran from 2 to 6 in the morning, when the corridor was darkest and the supervision was thinnest, and the young men with the uniforms and the mirrored sunglasses believed, correctly or not, that no one was watching. This is a pattern that repeats itself across every context in which human beings are given power over other human beings, from the cell blocks of Abu Ghraib to the overnight shifts of understaffed nursing homes, from the hazing rituals of fraternity basements to the interrogation rooms of police stations in every city in every country on Earth. Cruelty migrates toward darkness. It seeks out the gaps in observation, the blind spots in the architecture of accountability, the hours and the spaces where the fiction of oversight cannot reach, and it flourishes there, not because the people who commit it are fundamentally different from anyone else, but because darkness gives permission, because the absence of a witness functions as a kind of consent, as though the universe itself is saying, yes, go ahead, no one will know. And in that basement on the fifth night, no one was watching, or so the guards believed, and so the counts grew longer and stranger and more degrading, and the prisoners endured them because endurance was the only skill they had left, the only form of agency still available to a human being who's been reduced to a number and a smock and a chain. It was also on the fifth day that a new figure entered the experiment, a 20-year-old young man with short auburn hair and tired green eyes, and a round face with a reddish complexion, and the beginnings of patchy stubble on his jaw, and he had been brought in as a replacement prisoner, assigned the number 416, and from the moment he descended the stairs into the basement corridor, he understood that something was profoundly wrong. He had not been part of the gradual process of acclimatization that had brought the other prisoners to their current state. He had not experienced the slow and incremental erosion of selfhood that had carried them from resistance to resignation over the course of 5 days. He arrived all at once, stepping from the ordinary world of sunlight and campus pathways and undergraduate normalcy into a world that bore no resemblance to anything he had been told to expect, and the shock of it, the sheer dissonance between what he had imagined and what he encountered, produced in him not the compliant numbness that had overtaken the others, but something fiercer, something that the system had not been designed to accommodate. He refused to eat. It was a simple act, almost absurdly simple, the mere closing of a mouth, the turning away of a head, the quiet and persistent refusal to accept what was being offered. But in the context of a total institution, it was an act of extraordinary defiance, because it was the one thing the guards could not force, the one domain of autonomy that remained when every other domain had been colonized. You can make a man stand, you can make him lie down, you can make him count off his number and do push-ups and wear a stocking cap on his head, but you cannot make him swallow. The body retains that final veto, that last and irreducible sovereignty, and the young man with the auburn hair and the green eyes exercised it with a stubbornness that enraged the guards, precisely because it exposed the limits of their power, precisely because it reminded them that their authority, for all its theatrical completeness, stopped at the boundary of another person's will. They put him in the hole. The hole was a small dark closet, barely large enough to stand in, a space that had been designated for solitary confinement, and they locked him inside and left him there, and the darkness closed around him like a fist. And in that darkness he remained, hour after hour, alone with the sound of his own breathing and the muffled sounds of the corridor beyond the door. But the guards did not stop there, because solitary confinement, while effective as a punishment, did not address the deeper problem that the young man's hunger strike had created, which was the problem of example, the problem of a single act of resistance inspiring others, the problem of hope. And so they did something that revealed a sophisticated and intuitive understanding of the psychology of oppression, something that no one had taught them, something that emerged organically from the logic of the roles they had assumed. They turned the other prisoners against him. They told the remaining prisoners that the young man's hunger strike was selfish, that it would result in consequences for everyone, that they would all be punished for his refusal to comply. And the prisoners, who by this point had been so thoroughly broken that their primary allegiance was no longer to one another, but to the system that controlled them, accepted this framing. They did not rally around their fellow prisoner. They did not see his resistance as courageous or his suffering as their own. They saw him as a threat, as a troublemaker, as someone whose stubbornness was making their already unbearable situation worse, and they turned on him with the particular viciousness of the oppressed, who have been given permission to direct their rage downward instead of upward, who have been offered a target that is even more vulnerable than themselves. This is perhaps the most insidious mechanism of institutional power, more insidious than physical punishment, more insidious than deprivation or humiliation, or the systematic destruction of identity, because it conscripts the victims themselves into the machinery of their own oppression. It transforms solidarity into suspicion and compassion, into resentment, and shared suffering into competitive suffering, each prisoner measuring his own pain against the pain of others and concluding that someone else is not carrying his fair share. The young man with the auburn hair sat in the darkness of the hole and listened to the voices of the other prisoners calling him selfish, and in those voices he heard something that was worse than anything the guards had done. Because the guards were the guards. Their cruelty was expected. It was built into the architecture of the situation, but the other prisoners were supposed to be allies. They were supposed to understand, and their betrayal was a kind of loneliness so complete that it made the physical loneliness of the closet feel almost companionable by comparison. And through all of this, through the chaplain's visit and the sexual humiliation and the hunger strike, and the solitary confinement and the turning of prisoner against prisoner, the 38-year-old man with the dark curly hair and the wire-rimmed glasses sat in his office on the floor above the basement and monitored the situation. And the word monitored is important here because it implies a distance, a separation between the observer and the observed, and that separation no longer existed. He was not monitoring the experiment, he was running the prison. The transformation that had overtaken the guards and the prisoners had overtaken him as well, and it had done so with such subtlety, with such gentle and imperceptible gradations, that he had not noticed it happening, in the same way that you do not notice the movement of the hour hand on a clock, each individual moment indistinguishable from the one before it, the change only visible in retrospect when you look up and realize that hours have passed and you are somewhere you did not intend to be. When parents called to express concern about their sons, he did not respond as a researcher who valued the well-being of his subjects above all other considerations. He responded as a superintendent who was annoyed by outside interference, who viewed parental worry as a nuisance, who reassured them with the practiced smoothness of an administrator, protecting his institution from scrutiny. When a prisoner asked to leave, he did not immediately grant the request, as the ethical protocols of the study required. Instead, he found himself calculating, strategizing, looking for ways to convince the prisoner to stay, not because the data required it, not because the scientific objectives of the study demanded it, but because a prisoner leaving felt like a failure of his administration, a crack in the walls of the institution he had built, and he could not allow it. He could not allow it. Listen to those words and hear what they contain, because they contain the entire thesis of the experiment, compressed into 5 syllables. A man who had designed a study to examine the psychology of imprisonment had become so imprisoned by his own creation that he could no longer distinguish between what the experiment needed and what the prison needed, between the goals of science and the goals of control, between the role he was playing and the person he was. He was the superintendent. He had always been the superintendent. The researcher was a memory, growing fainter by the hour, a ghost haunting the edges of his awareness, occasionally surfacing to produce a flicker of unease that he quickly suppressed because there was work to do. There were problems to solve. There were prisoners who were causing trouble, and parents who were asking questions in a facility that needed to run smoothly and efficiently, and without disruption. The corruption was total. It was also invisible, because that is the nature of corruption when it operates from within, when it does not arrive as an external force but grows organically, from the logic of the situation, nourished by the same impulses that in other contexts produce leadership and dedication, and commitment to a cause. He was not a bad man. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had stepped into a system and allowed the system to think for him, and the system's thoughts were not his thoughts, and the system's values were not his values. But he could no longer tell the difference, and that inability, that blindness, is the beating heart of everything this experiment would come to mean. It was late on the 5th evening when she arrived, a 28-year-old woman with straight dark brown hair falling past her shoulders and warm brown eyes and a composed oval face that carried an expression of quiet determination. A recent doctoral graduate in psychology who had been invited by the professor to observe the experiment, to see what he had built, perhaps even to be impressed by it. She was his girlfriend. His. She had heard him talk about the study over dinners and phone calls, had listened to his descriptions of the methodology and the hypotheses and the emerging data with the supportive interest of a partner who understood and shared his professional passions. She expected to see an experiment. She walked down the stairs into the basement corridor of Jordan Hall at the moment when the guards were conducting the nightly bathroom run, and what she saw stopped her in the hallway, as though she had walked into a wall. She saw young men walking in a line with paper bags over their heads. She saw chains on their ankles, and she heard the chains before she saw them, the metallic clanking that echoed off the concrete walls and the linoleum floor, and filled the corridor with a sound that was not theatrical, that was not part of a performance, that was the real and actual sound of metal striking metal, as human beings shuffled forward in the darkness of their hoods, unable to see where they were going, guided only by the barked commands of other young men who wore uniforms and carried themselves with the rigid swagger of absolute authority. She saw the guards, and she saw the prisoners, and she saw the distance between them, a distance that was not physical, but ontological, as though they belonged to different species, as though the act of putting on a uniform or a smock had performed some fundamental alteration at the level of being itself, and something in her, something that 50 other visitors had either not possessed or not been able to access, something that had been sleeping in all those other observers who had come and gone and seen what she was seeing and had not said a word, that something woke up, and it woke up angry. She went upstairs. She found the man with the dark curly hair and the wire-rimmed glasses, the man she loved, the man she thought she knew, and she told him what she had seen. and her voice carried the weight of a conviction that did not waver, that did not soften itself to accommodate his authority, or his expertise, or his investment in the work. "What you're doing to those boys is terrible." That is what she said. Not what is happening to those boys as though it were a natural phenomenon, a weather event, something that had occurred without human agency or intention. What you're doing. You. The pronoun was a scalpel, and it cut through every layer of rationalization and professional detachment, an institutional logic that he had wrapped around himself like armor over the preceding 5 days, and it found the thing beneath, the thing that was still a researcher, still a human being, still a man who was capable of horror at his own actions, if only someone would hold up the mirror and refuse to let him look away. He argued with her. Of course he argued with her. The superintendent argued, because the superintendent's identity depended on the prison continuing, depended on the legitimacy of what was happening in the basement, depended on the framework of justification that had been constructed so carefully and so unconsciously over the past 5 days. He told her she did not understand. He told her the research was important. He told her that what she was seeing was not what she thought it was, that there was a context she was missing, a scientific rationale that made sense of everything, that transformed suffering into data and cruelty into methodology. But she did not relent. She stood in front of him, and she did not relent. And the argument that unfolded between them that night was not merely a disagreement between two psychologists about the ethics of a research protocol. It was a confrontation between the person he had become and the person he had been, between the logic of the system and the logic of basic human decency, between the seductive coherence of power and the stubborn, uncomfortable, irreducible demand of conscience. And somewhere in the course of that argument, somewhere in the space between her words and his resistance, something broke. Not dramatically, not with the clean snap of a bone or the sharp crack of glass, but with the slow and agonizing yield of a structure that has been bearing too much weight for too long, a gradual giving way, a settling, a collapse that felt less like destruction and more like surrender. He heard her. He finally heard her, not as the superintendent hearing a complaint from an outsider, but as a man hearing the truth from someone who loved him enough to speak it. That night, lying in whatever darkness he found himself in, he began the long and painful process of seeing what he had become. By the morning of the 6th day, the 38-year-old man with the dark curly hair and the wire-rimmed glasses walked down the stairs into the basement of Jordan Hall for the last time as the superintendent, and he ended the experiment. He called the guards and the prisoners together, and he told them it was over, and the word over hung in the air of that corridor like a foreign sound, like a word from a language that no one present quite remembered how to speak. The experiment that had been designed to run for 14 days was terminated after 6, not because the data was complete, not because the research questions had been answered, not because the funding had run out or the methodology had been compromised, but because a 28-year-old woman with dark brown hair and warm brown eyes had walked into a basement and seen what everyone else had either refused or been unable to see, and she had said so, loudly and clearly and without apology, and her voice had been the one voice in a chorus of silence that carried enough force to break the spell. What followed was the debrief, and the debrief was its own kind of revelation, a coda to the experiment that was in many ways as disturbing as the experiment itself. The guards and prisoners were brought together, no longer separated by roles or uniforms or the invisible architecture of power, just young men in a room, just undergraduate students who were the same age and came from the same backgrounds, and had been randomly assigned to their positions by the flip of a coin, and they sat across from each other and tried to make sense of what had happened to them. The guards' reactions spanned a spectrum that itself told a story. Some of them expressed shame, a hot and bewildered shame that reddened their faces and made their voices small. The shame of men who were only now beginning to understand what they had done, who were only now seeing their behavior from the outside as though they had been sleepwalking through the experiment and had just woken up to find their hands covered in something they could not identify. They said things like, "I do not know why I did that, and I am not like that, and that was not me." And in these protestations you could hear the desperate need to separate the self from its actions, to construct a firewall between identity and behavior, to believe that the person who had humiliated and degraded and tormented other human beings was a character, a role, a temporary aberration that had nothing to do with the real and essential person underneath. Others, including the 21-year-old with the sandy blonde hair and the cold pale blue eyes, expressed something closer to disappointment. Disappointment that it was over. Disappointment that the game had ended before they had finished playing it, before they had fully explored the territory that the role had opened up for them. This young man, the one the others had called by a nickname borrowed from a cowboy actor, said that he had been playing a role, just playing a role, and perhaps he believed this. Perhaps this was the story that made his behavior bearable, but the distinction between playing a role and being consumed by a role is a distinction that is easier to draw in theory than in practice, and the look in his pale blue eyes as he said it, the steadiness of his voice, the absence of the shame that trembled in the voices of the other guards, suggested that the role had fit him more comfortably than he was willing to admit, or perhaps more comfortably than he was able to recognize. The prisoners, for their part, sat quietly and listened, and some of them cried, and the crying was not the performative weeping of someone seeking sympathy, but the deep and involuntary crying of someone whose body is finally releasing what it has been holding, the way a dam cries when it breaks, not out of sadness, but out of the sheer accumulated pressure of everything that has been kept behind it. They spoke about what it had felt like, and their descriptions were not abstract or intellectual. They were visceral and specific and full of the kind of detail that only comes from lived experience. The feeling of the chain on the ankle at night when you turned in your sleep, the sound of the whistle at 2 a.m. when you were pulled from a dream into the blinding fluorescent reality of another count, the smell of the bucket in the cell when the guards refuse bathroom privileges, the particular quality of time when you have no access to clocks or windows or any external marker of the day's passage, the way minutes can feel like hours, and hours can feel like weeks, and an entire lifetime can seem to compress itself into the space between one count and the next. Some of them would have nightmares for weeks afterward. Some of them would find themselves flinching at loud noises or feeling a spike of anxiety at the sight of a uniform or waking in the middle of the night with the phantom sensation of a chain around their ankle that was no longer there. These were not the symptoms of people who had been playing a game. These were the symptoms of people who had been somewhere real, who had experienced something that their bodies and minds had registered as genuine trauma, regardless of what the consent forms had said, regardless of what the rational mind understood about the voluntary and temporary nature of the arrangement. The body does not read consent forms. The body does not understand the concept of a simulation. The body knows only what it experiences, and what these bodies had experienced was imprisonment, and they carried that experience forward into their lives the way all of us carry our most formative experiences, not as memories to be recalled at will, but as patterns etched into the nervous system, as templates that shape perception and reaction, and the fundamental sense of safety or danger that colours every waking moment. And then there is the statistic, the single data point that may be more important than everything else the experiment produced, more important than the behavioural observations and the personality assessments, and the theoretical frameworks and the decades of academic debate that would follow. More than 50 people came from the outside to observe the experiment during its 6 days of operation. 50 people, parents who visited their sons, a chaplain who interviewed the prisoners, a lawyer who was consulted about the rights of the subjects, other psychologists who came to watch, colleagues and peers and professionals trained in the science of human behaviour, graduate students and research assistants and friends of the research team. More than 50 pairs of eyes looked into that basement and saw what was happening, saw the paper bags over the heads and the chains on the ankles, and the young men shuffling in lines and the guards with their mirrored sunglasses and their whistles and their casual brutality. And of those 50-plus observers, exactly one raised an objection. One. The 28-year-old woman with the straight dark brown hair and the warm brown eyes. She was the only one. Everyone else saw what she saw and said nothing. They went home to their dinners and their families and their comfortable lives, and they did not pick up the phone, and they did not write a letter, and they did not walk back down those stairs and demand that it stop. 50 people, and 49 of them were silent. Let that number settle into you like a stone sinking to the bottom of a still pond, because it is the most important number in this entire story, more important than the 6 days or the 14 days or the 24 subjects or the $15 daily wage. 49 out of 50. That is the ratio of silence to speech in the face of visible suffering. That is the fraction of human beings who, when confronted with the evidence of cruelty being perpetrated by an authority they recognize, will choose to say nothing, will choose to look away, will choose to tell themselves that someone else will handle it, that it is not their place, that the people in charge must know what they're doing, that the institution must have its reasons. And this is not because those 49 people were cowards or monsters or morally deficient in some measurable way. They were ordinary people, decent people, educated people, people who would have described themselves as ethical and compassionate and committed to the well-being of others. They were people exactly like you, exactly like everyone you know, exactly like the person you see in the mirror when you brush your teeth before bed, and they said nothing, because the weight of institutional authority pressed down on their objections before those objections could fully form, because the presence of other silent observers confirmed the silence as appropriate, because the human mind has a profound and terrible talent for constructing narratives that transform inaction into reasonableness and complicity into neutrality. This is the bystander effect magnified to the scale of an institution. The diffusion of responsibility extended across an entire network of observers, each one assuming that someone else will act, each one taking comfort in the passivity of the others, each one contributing to the very silence that reassures the rest. And the lesson of that statistic, the lesson that rises from the basement of Jordan Hall like smoke, from something that has been burning for a very long time, is not that we should be more vigilant or more courageous or more willing to speak up, although all of those things are true. The lesson is that the forces arrayed against speaking up are enormous, are ancient, are woven into the very fabric of social cognition, and that overcoming them requires not just moral clarity, but a kind of moral stubbornness, a willingness to be the one person in the room who says the thing that no one else is saying, to absorb the social cost of dissent, to risk being wrong, to risk being dismissed, to risk being the person who ruins the evening or disrupts the protocol, or challenges the authority of someone who knows more than you do. It requires, in short, exactly what the 28-year-old woman with the warm brown eyes demonstrated on the 5th evening of the experiment, which was not extraordinary courage but ordinary decency applied with extraordinary persistence, the simple refusal to let what she'd seen be reframed or rationalized or explained away by someone she loved and respected. And so the experiment ended, not with a publication or a press conference or a neat and tidy conclusion, but with a woman's voice in a hallway and a man's slow and agonizing recognition of what he had become, and the sound of chains being removed from ankles, and the silence of a basement corridor that had heard too much, and the blinking, disoriented emergence of young men into sunlight they had almost forgotten existed, and the long, uncertain aftermath of learning that the distance between who you are and who you can become is not a distance at all but a single step, taken without thinking, in a direction you did not choose, on a path you did not see, toward a destination that was waiting for you all along, patient and quiet and utterly unsurprised by your arrival. And so the basement fell silent, the hallway emptied, the numbers were peeled from the smocks and the smocks were folded and placed in boxes, and the sunglasses were set down on a table, and the whistles went quiet, and the doors of those small rooms were left open for the first time in 6 days, and the fluorescent lights continued to hum as they always had, indifferent to what had transpired beneath them. And in that stillness a man with thick dark curly hair and a full dark beard sat alone in his office above the basement, wire-rimmed aviator glasses catching the lamplight, and he began to write. He wrote with the urgency of someone who believed he had witnessed something profound, something that revealed a truth about human nature so uncomfortable that the world needed to hear it immediately. And in the months that followed the summer of 1971, Philip Zimbardo began publishing his findings, presenting them at conferences, writing papers that would circulate through the corridors of academic psychology like a slow-burning fire. And the story he told was devastating in its simplicity. Ordinary young men, screened for psychological health, randomly assigned to roles, had within days become unrecognizable to themselves, the guards descending into cruelty, the prisoners collapsing into helplessness, and the architect of it all confessing that he too had been consumed by the very system he had created. The papers landed with force. They arrived at a moment in American history when trust in institutions was crumbling, when the war in Vietnam had revealed the capacity of ordinary soldiers to commit atrocities, when Watergate was about to expose the rot at the highest levels of government, and Zimbardo's experiment seemed to offer a scientific explanation for all of it. It was not that certain people were evil, it was that certain situations made people evil. The study took its place alongside Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments as one of the 2 most famous demonstrations in all of social psychology. twin pillars of a deeply unsettling argument that the line between good and evil was not drawn through the hearts of individuals but through the architecture of the circumstances in which they found themselves. And together these two studies entered the textbooks, the lecture halls, the popular imagination, becoming shorthand for a view of human nature that was at once terrifying and strangely forgiving. Because if situations could make anyone cruel, then perhaps cruelty was not a permanent stain on the soul, but a temporary deformation caused by pressure, by role, by context, by the invisible weight of a system pressing down upon the individual until something inside gave way. Within months of the experiment's conclusion, Zimbardo was invited to testify before the United States Congress. He walked into a hearing room in Washington and sat before a congressional committee investigating prison reform, and he described what had happened in that basement in Palo Alto, how quickly the simulated prison had become psychologically real, how the arbitrary assignment of power had corrupted those who held it and broken those who did not. And he argued that if this could happen in a mock prison run by a university professor with college students who knew they could leave at any time, then imagine what was happening in real prisons across America, where the power was absolute, the sentences were long, the oversight was minimal, and the dehumanization was not an experiment, but a policy. His testimony was eloquent, it was impassioned. It was heard by senators and representatives who nodded gravely and asked follow-up questions and thanked him for his contribution to the public understanding of incarceration. And then, as so often happens when uncomfortable truths are presented to those with the power to change things, very little changed. The prisons remained as they were. The guards continued to guard. The prisoners continued to serve their sentences in conditions that Zimbardo had shown, in miniature, could warp the human mind in less than a week. The system absorbed his critique the way a body absorbs a bruise, with temporary discoloration and eventual fading, and the Stanford prison experiment became not a catalyst for reform, but a cautionary tale told in classrooms, a story that everyone knew and no one acted upon. A piece of knowledge that sat in the collective consciousness like a stone at the bottom of a river, present but submerged, felt but not examined, there but not quite real enough to demand a response. And then, more than 30 years later, the experiment came back to life in the most horrifying way imaginable. In the spring of 2004, photographs began to emerge from a military prison in Iraq called Abu Ghraib, and the world saw images that seemed to have been pulled directly from the basement of Jordan Hall, American soldiers grinning over naked Iraqi prisoners who had been stacked in pyramids, forced into degrading positions, stripped of clothing and dignity, hooded and wired and leashed and mocked, and the photographs were so shocking, so visceral, so unmistakably reminiscent of what had happened in that Stanford basement that Zimbardo himself felt a chill of recognition that must have reached all the way to the bone. Here it was again, the same dynamics, the same dehumanization, the same transformation of ordinary people into instruments of cruelty. The soldiers in those photographs were not psychopaths. They were young men and women from small towns in America, people who had joined the military for college money, or a sense of purpose, or because they did not know what else to do with their lives, and they had been placed in a situation where prisoners were not quite human, where authority was diffuse and accountability was absent, where the night shift operated in a world without oversight, and they had done what Zimbardo's guards had done. They had filled the vacuum of structure with the improvisation of cruelty, and they had documented it with the casual cheerfulness of people who had lost the ability to see their actions as monstrous, because the situation had redefined monstrosity as routine. Zimbardo was called upon once more, this time not as a researcher presenting findings, but as an expert witness in a military trial. He testified on behalf of Staff Sergeant Ivan Frederick, known as Chip, one of the soldiers charged with abuse at Abu Ghraib, and his argument was the same argument he had been making for 3 decades, refined and deepened by years of reflection. It was not that Chip Frederick was a bad apple. It was that the barrel was bad. The system was bad. The chain of command that placed undertrained soldiers in charge of hundreds of prisoners in a war zone without adequate supervision or clear rules of engagement, the military culture that dehumanized the enemy, the political decisions that created the conditions for abuse. These were the forces that had transformed ordinary soldiers into torturers, and to punish the individuals without examining the system was to miss the point entirely, to treat the symptom while ignoring the disease, to pluck the rotten apple from the barrel while leaving the barrel to rot the next apple, and the next, and the next. Bad barrels make bad apples, Zimbardo argued, not the other way around. It was a powerful inversion of the usual moral logic, a challenge to the comforting belief that evil is something that lives inside certain people and can be isolated and punished and thereby eliminated. And it forced a question that most people would rather not ask, which is whether they themselves, placed in that same barrel, would have remained good, whether the line they drew between themselves and the soldiers in those photographs was as firm as they believed, or whether it was drawn in sand, vulnerable to the tide of circumstance. Frederick was convicted, the system was not, and Zimbardo returned to his work, now more convinced than ever that he had identified something fundamental about the human condition, something that needed to be articulated not just in academic papers, but in a form that the general public could access and absorb, and in 2007 he published a book called The Lucifer Effect, a title drawn from the theological tradition of the fallen angel, the idea that even the brightest light can be corrupted, that the transformation from good to evil is not a journey reserved for monsters, but a potential that lives within every human being, dormant and dangerous, waiting for the right conditions to awaken it. The book was sweeping in its ambition. It revisited the Stanford prison experiment in granular detail. It analysed Abu Ghraib through the lens of situational psychology, and it presented a comprehensive theory of how good people turn evil, a theory that drew on decades of research in social psychology to argue that three forces shape human behaviour: the individual, the situation, and the system that creates the situation, and that when we focus only on the individual, which is what our legal and moral frameworks are designed to do, we blind ourselves to the far more powerful forces of situation and system that are often the true causes of cruelty. The Lucifer Effect became a bestseller. It was translated into dozens of languages. It made Zimbardo one of the most famous psychologists in the world, a public intellectual who appeared on television and gave TED Talks, and was consulted whenever a new atrocity demanded explanation. And his message was always the same, delivered now by a man growing older, his hair turning white, his beard lightening, but his dark eyes still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, still carrying the intensity of someone who had looked into the basement of human nature and never fully looked away. He spoke of the banality of evil, a phrase borrowed from Hannah Arendt's analysis of Adolf Eichmann, the idea that the most terrible acts in human history were often committed not by demons but by bureaucrats, not by sadists, but by ordinary people following orders, filling roles, adapting to systems that had redefined cruelty as duty, and he extended this idea to argue that if evil is banal, then so too is heroism, that the same situational forces that can push a person toward cruelty can, if redirected, push a person toward courage, and that the goal of understanding situational evil is not to excuse it, but to prevent it, to design systems that bring out the best in people, rather than the worst, to be vigilant against the conditions that transform guards into tyrants and prisoners into shadows of themselves. But even as the Lucifer Effect was being celebrated, the experiment that lay at its foundation was beginning to crack. The criticisms had been there from the beginning. Quiet murmurs in the academic literature, methodological concerns raised by researchers who admired Zimbardo, but found his conclusions too sweeping for the evidence he had gathered. And over the years, those murmurs grew louder, more pointed, more difficult to dismiss, until they became a chorus that threatened to drown out the story that Zimbardo had been telling for decades. The first and most fundamental criticism was that the Stanford prison experiment was not, in any rigorous sense, an experiment at all. A true experiment requires a control group, a baseline against which the effects of the manipulation can be measured, and the Stanford study had no such group. There were guards and there were prisoners, but there was no condition in which participants were placed in the same environment without the roles, no way to determine whether the behaviour that emerged was caused by the roles themselves or by some other feature of the situation, the confinement, the boredom, the presence of authority figures, the knowledge that one was being observed. Without a control group, the study was less an experiment than a demonstration, a vivid and dramatic illustration of a hypothesis that could not be tested with the data that had been collected. Then there was the question of demand characteristics, the well-known phenomenon in psychology, whereby participants in a study behave not as they naturally would, but as they believe the experimenter wants them to behave. The young men who volunteered for Zimbardo's study knew they were in a psychology experiment. They knew they were being observed. They knew that the man running the study was interested in how people behave in prisons, and it was reasonable to ask whether some of their behaviour was driven not by genuine psychological transformation, but by a desire, conscious or unconscious, to give the professor what he was looking for, to play the role. Not because they had become the role, but because they understood what the role was supposed to look like and performed it accordingly, the way an actor performs a part, with conviction, but without the underlying reality that conviction is meant to represent. And then, in 2018, a journalist named Ben Blum published an exposé that struck at the heart of the experiment's credibility. Blum had obtained access to recordings and archives from the original study, and what he found was deeply troubling. The guards, it turned out, had not simply been assigned their roles and left to their own devices. They had been coached. Before the experiment began, Zimbardo and his research team had given the guards explicit instructions about how to behave, telling them to create an atmosphere of fear and powerlessness, to deny the prisoners their individuality, to make them feel that the situation was inescapable. This was not the spontaneous emergence of tyranny from the mere assignment of power. This was directed behaviour, shaped and encouraged by the experimenter himself, and if the guards had been told to be tough, then their toughness was not evidence that situations create cruelty, but evidence that people follow instructions, which was a far less revolutionary finding, one that Milgram had already demonstrated more rigorously a decade earlier. Blum's exposé also revealed what had happened to one of the experiment's most dramatic moments. The breakdown of prisoner 8612, the young man named Douglas Corpy, who had screamed and wept and begged to be released in scenes that had become iconic representations of the experiment's power. Corpy, it turned out, had admitted years later that he had faked his breakdown. He had not been psychologically shattered by the experience of imprisonment. He had wanted to leave the experiment so that he could study for his graduate school entrance exams, and when his initial requests to leave were denied, he had escalated his performance, screaming and crying in a deliberate effort to convince the experimenters that he was too distressed to continue. The breakdown that had been presented for decades as evidence of the experiment's devastating psychological impact was, by Corpy's own account, a performance, an act of manipulation by a participant who understood the game and played it to his advantage, and this revelation cast a shadow over every other dramatic moment in the experiment, raising the question of how much of what happened in that basement was genuine psychological transformation and how much was theatre, participants playing parts in a drama that they understood was expected of them. Further archival research by the French academic Thibault Letexier deepened the crisis. Letexier had gained access to Zimbardo's own records, the audio recordings, the notes, the internal communications of the research team, and he found evidence that the guards had received far more direction and encouragement from the experimenters than Zimbardo had ever publicly acknowledged. The narrative of spontaneous cruelty, of ordinary people independently discovering the pleasures of domination, was complicated by evidence of a guiding hand behind the scenes, an experimenter who was not merely observing, but actively shaping the behaviour he claimed to be documenting, and this raised the most damaging criticism of all, the criticism that Zimbardo was not a neutral scientist studying the effects of power, but an active participant in his own experiment, a man who had created a situation, encouraged certain behaviours within that situation, and then presented those behaviours as naturally occurring phenomena, a conjurer who had hidden his own hand in the trick and then marvelled at the magic. The replication attempts told a similar story. In 2002, the BBC commissioned psychologists Alexander Haslam and Stephen Riker to conduct a study modelled on the Stanford prison experiment, with proper ethical oversight and systematic observation, and the results were startlingly different from what Zimbardo had reported. In the BBC prison study, the guards did not become more authoritarian over time, they became less so. They were uncomfortable with their power. They sought to minimise the hierarchy rather than exploit it. The prisoners, meanwhile, did not become passive and broken, but organised and resistant, eventually overthrowing the guard regime entirely. The study suggested that the relationship between power and cruelty was far more complex than Zimbardo's narrative implied, that the mere assignment of authority did not automatically produce tyranny, that context and personality and values and group dynamics all played roles that the Stanford experiment, with its lack of controls and its coached participants, and its experimenter as participant, had failed to account for. The accumulation of these criticisms was devastating. By the late 2010s, the Stanford prison experiment occupied an uncomfortable position in the history of psychology, simultaneously one of the most famous studies ever conducted, and one of the most thoroughly discredited, a study that everyone knew about, and that many experts no longer believed, a cultural touchstone built on methodological sand, and Zimbardo, now an elderly man with thinning white hair and a trimmed white beard, his dark eyes still sharp behind modern wire-rimmed glasses, found himself defending not just a study but a life's work, a career that had been built on the foundation of 6 days in a basement, that may not have demonstrated what he had always claimed they demonstrated. And yet, and this is where the story resists the clean resolution that critics would prefer, the defenders of the experiment's core insight make a point that is not easily dismissed. The methodological criticisms are valid. The coaching of guards, the lack of controls, the demand characteristics, the faked breakdowns, all of these are real problems that compromise the study's scientific value. But the question is whether the baby should be thrown out with the bathwater, whether the demolition of the experiment as a piece of science necessarily demolishes the insight that the experiment was meant to illustrate. And on this point, reasonable people disagree. Because the world has provided its own experiments, uncontrolled and uncoached and horrifyingly real. Abu Ghraib was not a psychology study. The guards at Abu Ghraib were not coached by a professor to be cruel. They were not performing for an experimenter. They were not trying to fulfill the expectations of a research design. They were ordinary people placed in a situation that facilitated cruelty, and they became cruel, and the photographs they took suggest that they did not experience their cruelty but as humour, as routine, as the way things were done in that place at that time, and this pattern, this transformation of ordinary people into instruments of abuse under specific situational conditions, has been documented not just at Abu Ghraib but in Rwanda, where neighbours killed neighbours with machetes during the genocide, and in the former Yugoslavia, where communities that had lived together in peace for decades suddenly fractured along ethnic lines into perpetrators and victims, and in countless other historical episodes where the question was not what kind of people did these things, but what kind of situations turned people into the kind of people who did these things. The real-world evidence for situational effects on behaviour does not depend on the Stanford prison experiment. It predates it. It surrounds it. It extends far beyond anything that could be demonstrated in a basement with college students. And the defenders of Zimbardo's core insight argue that even if the experiment itself was flawed, even if the methodology was compromised, even if the data cannot support the weight that has been placed upon it, the underlying truth remains, which is that human behaviour is shaped by situations far more powerfully than most people are comfortable admitting, and that the capacity for cruelty is not a trait that some people have and others lack, but a potential that exists in everyone, activated by circumstances and suppressed by circumstances, present in the saint and the sinner alike, differing only in the conditions that have been allowed to act upon it. The participants themselves carried the experiment forward in their bodies and their memories long after the basement was emptied and the doors were locked. Some of them became advocates for prison reform, their brief experience of simulated incarceration having given them a visceral understanding of what it meant to be stripped of autonomy and dignity and identity that no textbook could have provided. They spoke at conferences. They participated in documentaries. They allowed their experience to be used as a teaching tool, a warning, a mirror held up to a society that preferred not to look too closely at its own institutions of confinement and control. Others wanted only to forget. They had spent 6 days in a role that had revealed something about themselves, or about the world, or about the fragile membrane between the person they believed themselves to be and the person they could become under pressure, and that revelation was not something they wished to revisit. They moved on with their lives. They became teachers, engineers, businessmen, fathers and grandfathers, carrying the memory of those 6 days like a small scar, healed but not invisible, a reminder of a time when the world had tilted beneath their feet and they had learned something about gravity that they could never unlearn. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the Stanford prison experiment, not as a piece of science, which can be critiqued and defended and debated in journals and at conferences until the end of academic time, but as a story, a parable, a dark fairy tale about the human capacity for transformation, a story that resonates not because its methodology was sound, but because it touches something that we recognize, something that we have seen in the news and in history and perhaps, in our most honest moments, in ourselves. The story of the basement is the story of what happens when the structures that hold civilization in place are removed or distorted, when the rules that govern how we treat one another are suspended or rewritten, when the roles we play become more real than the people we are, and the question it leaves us with is not whether the experiment was well designed, but whether we are well designed. Whether the species that built the cathedrals and wrote the symphonies and walked on the moon is also the species that built the camps and dug the mass graves and stood grinning over the broken bodies of the powerless? And the answer, of course, is yes. It is the same species. It has always been the same species, and the distance between the cathedral and the camp is not as great as we would like to believe. And the basement in Palo Alto, whatever its flaws as a scientific endeavour, reminded us of that distance, or rather of its absence, and that reminder, uncomfortable and unwelcome and resistant to the reassurances we offer ourselves about our own fundamental goodness, is perhaps worth preserving even if the vessel that carries it is cracked. And now the basement is quiet. The fluorescent lights that hummed through those 6 days in August of 1971 have long since been replaced. The tubes recycled, the ballasts updated, and the corridor that once served as a simulated prison has returned to its original purpose, a hallway in the psychology building of Stanford University, a place where students walk to class and professors carry their coffee, and the sound of footsteps echoes against concrete walls that remember nothing, because walls do not remember, only people remember, and the people who were there are growing old now, their hair turning grey and then white, their memories softening at the edges the way all memories do, the sharp details of those 6 days blurring into something more like a dream, the kind of dream that feels real while you're inside it and unreal the moment you wake. And perhaps that is the nature of all intense experiences, that they exist most vividly in the moment of their occurrence and then begin to fade, not disappearing entirely but losing their solidity, becoming more like stories we tell about ourselves than events we lived through, and the stories change each time we tell them, not because we are dishonest, but because memory is not a recording, but a reconstruction, and each reconstruction is shaped by what we have learned since, by what we need the story to mean now, by the person we have become in the years since the person we were walked into that basement and emerged 6 days later as someone slightly different, someone who knew something they had not known before, something about the world or about themselves or about the space between the two that can never be fully mapped. The corridor is empty now. If you were to walk through it today, you would hear nothing but the ordinary sounds of a university building. The distant hum of ventilation, the faint buzz of lighting, the muffled conversation of people going about their lives in the rooms above and below and beside this unremarkable hallway, and there would be nothing to tell you that this was the place where young men were stripped of their names and given numbers, where they wore smocks and carried chains and slept on thin mattresses on concrete floors, where they were awakened in the middle of the night for counts and punished for infractions they did not commit, and slowly, gradually, almost imperceptibly came to accept the roles they had been assigned as if those roles were their identities, as if the number on the smock was more real than the name on the driver's license they had surrendered at the door. You would not know any of this from the hallway itself, and the silence settles and the breathing slows and the story is done and sleep arrives.